Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am joined today by Dylan Burns. Dylan, could you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, my name is Dylan Burns. I'm a streamer and a conflict journalist, currently covering the war in Ukraine, focusing on that quite a lot. And I also am known for hosting the show, the Hippy Dippy Roundtable, which is going to be relaunching very soon, August 16th.
The first topic is the filibuster. Should it be kept? Should it not? Thrown up to the room? You may be
Absolutely not.
No.
So there is a lot of ground to cover. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll say up front, a big reason that I was interested in talking to you is because of not only your notoriety in the online political space and the debate space with the Hippy Dippy Roundtable. We'll talk about that more later. But I'm also especially interested in talking to you for my show because of the work that you do over in Ukraine and the fact that you've been able to cover the war in Ukraine with Russia on the ground as it's been unfolding, which I think is really, really unique. So thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here. You're a Marylander, and I must support all Marylanders and all of their goals and achievements.
Yeah, obviously, right?
Absolutely. Maryland supremacy all the way. I'm a pan-Maryland nationalist, after all.
Amazing. So for people who are watching, because, we appeal to, there are people who are watching who are probably already familiar with you, but I'm also trying to appeal to people with more of a professional background and more of like a mainstream political background. So for people who aren't as familiar with you, how did you get your start in the online political space and creating political content? What was your motivation? What really was the impetus for getting involved? Yeah, how'd you get started?
Well, I didn't really start with politics with online, like interacting with streamers and stuff like that. I started local. I interned with SCIU, 1199 SCIU, which is a healthcare workers union in the area, because I grew up in a very pro-union household. My grandfather was a union man, my grandmother was a union man, and they were the ones who raised me, so I really support unions. I still do support unions. Mm-hmm. I was also interested in doing stuff with local politics. I did some work for the 21st District. I was a delegate in the Maryland General Assembly while I was still in high school. I ended up working for a short period on the Mike Gravel for President campaign, which is how a decent amount of people knew me. I was very angry about how the war in Yemen was going and weapons sales to certain countries, and I was like, Mike Gravel obviously can't be president, but if we have somebody up there saying, maybe we should stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia to continue this war that has no end in sight, then and plus it'd be a good experience. It'd be good to build the experience, and so that's what I did. I managed the Maryland state campaign, but the whole campaign was mostly just social media stuff. There was like some small attempts at ground game, but it was impossible because it was mostly just a kind of almost like an activist, like we don't want a lot of war campaign.
Gotcha. So was it that experience working with the Gravel campaign that like motivated you to do more work on social media, or how did that transition end up happening?
It didn't. The social media with the Gravel team didn't motivate me to do more social media stuff. If anything, it made me want to maybe do more on the groundwork because I was like, well, I mean, even though we hit the donation goal for the Gravel team, we weren't able to get them on the debate stage anyway, and it was like, well, maybe I would want to do something IRL for a bit. But there was conversations happening online with some streamers, Destiny, Vosh, and others in the area around issues that I cared about. I think it was around the Hong Kong, and there was also a conversation about, I think, the coup in Bolivia that was going on, and a few other conversations as well. And I just left a few comments, and they responded to my comments. I sent an email or two, and I went on the shows, and
sure, but I mean that's already started to happen, right? Like we withdrew from the Iran
agreement,
like definitely. We're tariffing the fuck out of even our allies. Other people like Merkel have said things like the U.S. is not reliable. It seems like that's kind of what's already begun, or that path has already started.
I would say a good example of something we could do is we have a lot of work we do in South America. If we were to deal with the economic issues or development in South America, not only would it help us by, the better they're doing, the more people that'll buy our products and other things and vice versa, but also help deal with the horrible drug war, which has been, just destroying people in our country and as well as South America. I think developing South America and having some type of initiative, development initiative would be extremely productive for the region.
I got enough of a positive response that I thought, well, I'm about to turn 18. I'm about to, look out for a job, and I wonder if it would be worth it taking a risk and just getting a simple streaming set up and trying this for a bit. I mean, I'm young. If it doesn't work, I can just quit and move on, and I did. And then eventually, once I did the Hippy Dippy Roundtable, it was enough money that when I had a short bout of homelessness, I was able to get myself off the street, which was great. I had my own place to live, and I've been streaming ever since.
That's awesome, especially because I don't think that there's probably a lot of streamers out there who come from a background that has more IRL political experience. That's commonly like a criticism levied online is that like, oh, well, a lot of people are talking about politics who have like no applied experience. But you've worked in campaigns, you worked in the Maryland General Assembly. What work did you do over there?
Maryland General Assembly. I was just a delegate, like a delegate's aide. Well, actually, I was its aide in the Senate. Just like paperwork, coffee. It's mostly an experience for us to learn while giving them a little bit of free labor when it comes to the paperwork and such, and setting up desks. I got to watch like the comings and goings of the Senate. I got to fall asleep during a few oyster debates. My gosh,
those are the best debates.
No, it was crazy. I'm not a I'm a Marylander, diehard. I love crab cakes.
You came in on the side of the oysters, right?
After this, we're getting crab cakes, 100%. Because I want crab cakes, and she wants to bring me to a good crab cake place. But I'm not a big oyster guy. So I didn't really care. But sitting there and watching the oyster fishermen up there just yelling at the legislators as they talk about implementing more environmental policy, that like fishery culture fascinated me, just seeing, because I was falling asleep and then I woke up because all the fishermen just started just belting out, and I've never seen more energy in the Senate than when they were debating oyster regulations.
Well, yeah, you can never attack big oyster in Maryland.
No,
like, come on,
no, you can't.
That's the first rule.
It's. I mean, I can believe. I mean, I would be in their shoes if it was crabs and crab cakes and stuff like that. But
yeah, I mean, like in my position, I'm saying like, why would you want to attack big oyster to begin with? That's like attacking Old Bay. Like you just can't do that in Maryland.
No, you can't do that. You can't do that.
Put it on everything, Old Bay.
You're attacking the state itself. You're attacking people's identity.
Exactly, especially my identity. All right, there's two things I love in this world. Well, I don't want to say only two things, but like my two favorite foods, bar none, is going to be crab and oysters. All right,
I'm running for president of Belgium, and I just want to say that too much chocolate, too much chocolate.
Oh God. But no, I mean, like it's impressive still that you have like that experience. Like that experience is still going to be better. I remember my first time working in the General Assembly when I was working for Delegate Sandy Rosenberg, where that was probably a similar position to yours, probably a little bit more experience because I was working like, that was a legal intern. That was when I was in law school and I was able to work on some more substantive policy issues. But, being able to have a background where you understand the culture of a legislature and being able to understand at an intimate level, like how actually the sausage is made.
Yeah.
I think is super duper valuable because you see a lot of people post online all the time where it's like, they say things like, oh, well, why doesn't President Biden just, sorry, hair on my face. They say things like, oh, well, why doesn't President Biden just fix everything with the sign of his pen, right? Yeah. And it's just like, well, that isn't how our government works, right? And so being able to approach those conversations with a better background and understanding how that all works, I think is something that's really helpful to you. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think a good example would be like Roe versus Wade getting overturned. We hear this all the time, like Roe versus Wade got overturned under your watch, Biden. So I mean, obviously it's your fault. When I would more point towards people who didn't emphasize the importance of the judge picks during the 2016 election, and that took a back seat. That took a back seat to all of the chaos and grab them by the whatever. And all of the, the kind of sludgy campaigning of Donald Trump, when there were real substantive, like, judicial issues that were really put on the back burner. So I think that, like, there is certain policy stuff that a lot of people just don't know, and they just think the president is kind of like anointed king god, and he gets to decide everything that happens, when that isn't the case. When I talk to people about, like, instituting policy in Maryland, we'll talk about a policy. Like, this is a popular policy. Why hasn't it been introduced? And it's like, well, who's on the committee that it would have to go through before being introduced, and who's heads of the committee, what are the votes like in this committee. It could have 60% support in the whole state, but if the committee is made up of people who don't support it because maybe they think they want to represent developers in a certain way, or they want to represent certain groups, like religious groups who might not agree with the regulation on like private religious schooling or something along those lines, like they just don't understand, like, a lot of how that sausage is made, like you said.
Yeah. So taking that experience, all right, so you have a decent amount of experience in, like, more applied IRL politics. So when you started getting involved in streaming, how did that translate over to what you started doing? And I'm especially interested in hearing like how you eventually, because one of the big projects that you're known for was starting the Hippy Dippy Roundtable. I guess I'm interested in like if that background had anything to do with thinking of that program, or like what was the motivation for developing that roundtable?
I think one thing that so when I went into first doing streaming, a lot of it was just kind of reading articles and talking about the articles and me looking at what other people did and just kind of doing what they did. And that's how a lot of people start streaming.
Sure.
But when it came to the roundtable, something that I noticed was that the conversations that were happening in the space were mostly between people like it'd be, I am a Maoist and I'm a Marxist, Leninist, oh, I'm a Trotskyite, and we're going to discuss the big issues that concerns most of Americans. Or you go to the other end
Very
of the spectrum,
important.
and it's like, oh, I'm MAGA, oh, I'm also MAGA, or well, actually, I'm actually I'm an alt conservative. It's like a bunch of like other fringe. It's like none of these people are going to sit down and talk about the child tax credit. None of these people are going to sit down and be able to have a rational conversation about everyday issues that most people can apply to. It's not that those conversations have no place. It's just for general audiences or for people who aren't in those groupings who are going to understand the terminology, even just on a base level, let alone see if they agree with the ideas. It'd be much better to have a place where people on the left wing spectrum, on the right wing spectrum, that can communicate with the majority of Americans about issues that at least somewhat matter in most instances, can like kind of hash it out in the space. And it was difficult to do that for a whole host of reasons. Number one, people were scared of leaving their spaces because they might get hurt. They might get. It's not like, oh my gosh, they're gonna destroy their lives, but nobody wants to get embarrassed or be shown to be unknowledgeable or possibly quote unquote help the other side. That was one disincentive. Another disincentive is you need a host that people can trust to moderate neutral enough. They don't need to be like a cookie cutter, like nobody knows what they believe. They're just like a blank slate completely. But they have to trust them to be unbiased enough in these conversations to host you, which a lot of people just don't trust left-wing or right-wing streamers to be able to do that. And so I ended up just wanting to facilitate those conversations because I felt like a lot of the conversations that were in the space either were not relevant or were not interesting, or were between a bunch of people who agreed with each other. It was just how different stripes of how they agreed with each other. Like, oh, well, of course, you know, we should all have Medicare for all, but how Medicare for all should it be? You know, how much should it cover? Should it cover these surgery? When the majority of Americans aren't there yet. They need to have a conversation that could maybe even guide them in that direction in the first place. You can't just end in that conclusion, all agree with everyone, not show a mental path to how you get there to the audience. You're not even convincing anyone like that. You're just getting a bunch of people on the internet who already agreed to you to subscribe to you on Patreon.
Yeah, I actually really like that framing. It relates to something I was thinking about recently in kind of like a larger political philosophy sense, right? Because I do think that you're right, that a lot of people, especially you see this, a good analogy is like IRL and like advocacy groups and advocacy spaces, right? There are some similarities between the behavior that you described, where a lot of those conversations among advocates and advocate groups usually are just talking about like different shades of basically the same conclusion, and you don't really get any buy-in or any interest from people who aren't already predisposed to agree with that position, right? And that can pose, if you aren't balancing that with conversations where you are trying to convince people and bring people from across the other aisle to your position or closer to it, it can pose issues because we live in a democracy. And at the end of the day, if you want to be able to actually enact policy, enact law, and actually make substantive policy change, then you need to, it is a requirement to convince at least 50 plus 1% of the voting population to agree with you.
Yeah,
right?
And it's not just about convincing people to agree with you. And I'm saying this from somebody who obviously comes from a left-wing, more, you know, democratic-leaning perspective in the United States. But it's not just changing people's minds. It's about giving people the tool to defend their own ideas. So that when they're at the dinner table and somebody says something to them about whether or not the Dreamers should be extended, you know, full citizenship in the United States, and if you don't have conversations with people where somebody could give pushback, or you could even just register what that pushback is, then you're at the dinner table, you have no clue what to say, you start doubting yourself, and then maybe you're getting pulled away not because, oh, you had a bad idea, but because you never heard any counter. And if you hear that counter, you might have time to think about it. You might be able to hear what a counter to that might be, like, oh, you're misquoting some data, quote unquote, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that it really is good for people to, exercise their mind in these ways, not just, for the people involved in the conversations, but the people who are watching the conversations to at least hear both sides of a conversation.
Yeah, it reminds me of something. I'm going to quote another political streamer here, Destiny, where I think that he's made a similar point previously by saying that, one point in favor of either debate or like directly addressing opposition arguments is that it can at least keep you sharp, right? Even if you, let's say you're morally lucky enough to arrive at, for the most part, like the right conclusions, or what we would, for the most part, agree are the right conclusions. If you're morally lucky enough to end up there, then that's great, until someone tries to push back against you and suddenly you don't know how to be able to actually argue the particulars of that particular policy. Like you feel intuitively like, oh, I know I'm in the right, but I don't know how to explain or articulate that. And that can be really, really dangerous, because that can let those bad ideas, whatever they may, we won't go into specific examples, but that can let those more easily spread if people just don't know how to respond to them.
People will talk about like how important debate really is. And I will say, like, for example, presidential debates usually don't have that big of an impact on the election. But
we're in an exceptional year then.
Right. Right now, we can see that depending on how bad it actually is, or how bad you are at defending your ideas, like you could actually straight up just flop. Yeah. You could really crash. Now, obviously, in most situations, if you get to that level, that's not going to be a problem. The circumstances here with Biden's age is a little different, but people do need the basic tools to be able to defend their ideas. Because when you're having these conversations, especially in rooms of like crowded rooms of people, if you perform bad in conversation, yourself looking bad is one thing, you feeling embarrassed is one thing, you reconsidering your own ideas is one thing. But if you got like a whole crowd of people in there, and these conversations are happening with or without the left, with or without people who are hosting these conversations in a more equitable manner, in a manner that's going to give like fair time to both sides to really hash it out. Like trigonometry, modern day debates, like all the shows that are out there, they're going to keep hosting whether or not these moral quandaries exist. So, I think the question should be, how do we create an environment that best hosts the conversations that Americans want to hear in a way that shows the perspectives that Americans have, so they can see those perspectives clash with the ones up there, as well with, if you're lucky, injecting expertise opinion to help educate people.
Yeah. Gosh, I have a couple thoughts. First, regarding expertise opinion, because you brought that up, I do really like that. And I think it's really hard to find situations where you can get people with expertise to not only be able to respond to those kinds of arguments, but to do so in a way that is convincing, right? Because there's two elements to usually these kinds of conversations. Usually, in order to be able to have those kinds of convos like what you're describing, or those kind of debates, not only do you need to be knowledgeable enough in the conversation to at least convince most viewers that you're knowledgeable, right? I'm going to put an asterisk up next to that, because technically you don't actually have to be knowledgeable. You just have to convince people that you are, right? So like, I don't know, I'm not going to talk about like sophistry and all that, because philosophy a little, but like what really matters is audience perspective. But if you're able to convince the audience that you're knowledgeable on the topic, and also you know how to speak in a public setting, usually a live format, like being able to have those kinds of witty responses, being able to know how to respond to opposing arguments on the fly, having those two things together is really hard, especially for like, I think of like academics or like long-standing like scholars of certain issue areas. Like you could have someone who knows everything that there is to know about a particular policy area, but like, are they going to be equipped to debate like one of the, I won't name particular names, but like one of the many like very online, very far right, like hardcore MAGA or even further right debate bros online? Like, I'm not sure if they're equipped to be able to do that, because it's just a different skill set. And so I guess, so pivoting off that, I guess I want to ask a little bit if you could talk about your experience running Hippy Dippy and how you've dealt with having conversations between people of very different political backgrounds. And yeah, I don't know, like, I guess I'm interested in your experience with like how you've been able to manage that for the time that you've done it.
You have to be to be blunt, firm, and fair.
Hmm.
If you can't hold standards for different people no matter the status of who they are on your show.
Hmm.
If you do, no matter their political ideology or viewership, it's going to make the other guests uncomfortable. The viewers, who are always going to be on top of these type of things, are going to notice, and so you have to hold them all by the same standard.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this can be a problem when you're working with people who are not used to doing that, and they're especially not used to being treated. Not used to being treated like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they're especially not used to being treated like that on a guest of other people, treated just like they're worth as much as them when they are much bigger an audience.
Yeah.
And that makes it difficult to get some returning guests. But I feel that the other guests who are going to be more likely to come on my show anyway, and more likely to give me a better show overall, are going to appreciate that. And it makes it so if you disagree with me and you can understand the logic of how I am moderating, and you can see consistency in that logic, you're going to trust me to moderate a conversation where if I wanted to, depending on how I guide the conversation, what statements people focus on, how if I say, wait a second, say that again, I don't think the audience, there's certain ways you can do, really manipulate just the tenor of the conversation in not a super direct way, but direct enough to make them just look awful, just based on the most slight of slip-ups, or how you ask the questions, for example, where you start the conversation, what you choose to focus on when you ask questions to people. And a lot of moderators think it's really, think it's smart to commentate and to give their own ideas during these. I'm not going to name any names, but I've always disagreed with that. I think it breaks trust in the people who are there. I think it can tilt the balance of the conversation one way or the other. I think that it makes it so, I think the people at home are not watching to hear you. They're watching to see the people you brought on. You want to have your own show. Have your own show in your own time. If you're having your show and giving your opinions while you have everybody else there, what I feel like, and I'm saying this not trying to be mean to anybody, that you're doing that because you couldn't get everybody in the stream to listen to you while it was just you. So now you're using the opportunity to try to get your own voice out there, but nobody's there to listen to you in the moment. They're there to watch the show. They're there to watch the mechanisms of the shows that you made. You're an engineer. And if you engineer something, people want to watch it function, not necessarily you like taking up the spot. You engineered the conversation. Let your work, let your arc function. Let it flow.
Yeah. Damn. All right. Throwing some shade a little bit.
I'm not throwing shade at anyone in particular. I'm just saying that I think it makes a better show. I'm not saying nobody can do that and not make a good show. I just think that the art flows much better. The conversations flow better. And what the audience wants is more pure when you guide the conversation, not involve yourself in the conversation. Can I also say one more answer to the last question? It's also like herding cats to get any of these streamers to manage their schedule. A ton of last-second cancellations. We always have last-second replacements. Because we've had multiple times where it's 2 hours to showtime, an hour to showtime, and people cancel. And there's also people like an hour to showtime where they answer and say, okay, sure, I'll be on, when we've already replaced them. Streamers...
Oh, yeah.
It's like herding cats. And every other person I've spoken to in private about what it's like to try to manage it, it's always the same conversation about the same problems. And man, I didn't know how you could... I know Counterpoints, who did a panel show, had the same problem with trying to manage these people. And how unprofessional a lot of them are because they've never been in a professional workspace, which I think is one thing that did also help me from doing maybe more actual politics stuff, is I'm not great at organizing stuff, but having been in those spaces, I at least know what a professional workspace looks like. It's like if I see a helicopter upside down in a tree, I don't need to be a pilot to be like, yeah, you messed up. It's like I don't.
Sure.
I have enough sense to at least see when something's going wrong and know we have to kick the engine or do something to change it.
Yeah, so the question was about how you go about managing those relationships.
Oh,
so
managing. I got you.
So especially given that a lot of people who you work with have very different political backgrounds.
I have to, honestly, the political background stuff is not most of the problem. Because in my experience, if you're going on my show and you want to be on my show and I was going to book you on the show, and then I book someone who really, really disagrees with you, you sign up to be on my show because you want to talk to people that disagree with you.
Sure.
If you come on my show and then they're like, I'm sorry, but he disagrees with me too much on this, or, then I don't know why you came on my show. So it has to be, it's usually personal revulsion with their actions. So they've done something, either one thing that people talk about is Lauren Southern and the boats, that a lot of people wouldn't want to talk to Lauren Southern
Gotcha.
because of the boat thing. and so you just don't book those people with Lawrence Southern.
Mhm.
Or another thing that I sometimes hear is just interpersonal drama, interpersonal problems. For example, and I can say I'm gonna be a lot more chatty this time around when I manage these. Now I'll be quiet when I need to be quiet, but when I don't think it's a risk to business, I'll be more chatty, and I'll
Okay.
be chatty with you specifically.
Aw, thank you.
So this will be released when?
This will be released probably like I'll probably give it like a week.
Okay, so this will be after the show.
This will be after the show.
So the show already
I'll
be
wait
done.
until after
The
the
show
show.
will already be done.
Yeah.
So for this show, I wanted to book for the left and right. What we have now is like Adam Mockler.
Oh,
we have
can we
Loner
pause?
Box.
For context for people who are watching, Dylan stopped. He retired for a period of time, the Hippy Dippy show, and then you're bringing it back, right?
We're bringing it back, and we can talk about why in a moment. But we're booking Adam Mockler, Loner Box, President Sunday, and there's one more left winger, and I forget who it's Crenshaw, who's like a smaller left winger who's going up, and we always try to include some small content creators because we want to bring people up.
That is certainly an interesting roster.
We want to bring people up. On the other side is a bunch of right wingers. Hake. It'll be interesting to see Hake and President Sunday go at it.
Oh my god!
Oh my gosh, those two. Knowing President Sunday's tenor and the type of thing that can get him going, interacting with someone like Jesse Lee Peterson's co-host who believes everything he says. It's not a joke. And we also got Lecture Fan there, but we also have some like Jeb Tan and others to mellow them out. Originally, though, we were trying to think about booking some other people, and Not So Erudite was an option.
Okay.
But I decided against booking Not So Erudite. And the reason why is I already know President Sunday and Lonerbox don't like each other. And booking them on the same thing is already possibly a problem. And I can deal with one interpersonal, like take out the whip quick and just get back there, mute them for a second. Get back in line, you two. But if it's Not So Erudite, President Sunday, and Lonerbox, and these three people, like Erudite and Loner are cool, but both of these people don't like President Sunday. President Sunday definitely doesn't like those two.
Sure.
It's going to be too much problem that I'm going to be planting the seeds that's going to lead to them crashing and burning in a conversation. And so even if individually all those people will perform well enough in a conversation, putting them together, it's like the opposite of the Spice Girls. When the Spice Girls were, apart, they were terrible. Together, they were good. In this case, it's the opposite. If I was to do that, if I was to make that if I was to consciously know about these interpersonal problems and book them together. Now I'm doing it with Loner and President Sunday because it'll be funny. But a little bit. But I think that they are both. If it's just that, they'll both be professional enough to keep it together, or they'll just nudge each other. And I don't care if they give a little nudge. But if it dominates the conversation, then it's no longer about the politics. It's no longer about the issues that everybody cares about. It's about the drama. And the drama gets viewership. The drama gets, attention. I'll let it come in every once in a while. But if it dominates, it's no longer about the topic. It's no longer about things that everyday people care about. And now you have to be bought into the personalities to like the content. Where if you balance it, and you have maybe a tiny bit of drama, but mostly the content, then we're appealing to people for both the content and the personalities. Yeah. Like the policy content, the debates, the disagreements. And I don't want this to become TMZ. So you have to be careful when it comes to bookings like that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It sounds like, and especially, I want to talk about this a little bit because I think this is a fine line that almost, if not every political content creator walks in this space because, as I've talked about with other people who I've interviewed for my show, drama is probably one of, if not the easiest way to get views for any content creator, and especially for political content creators. However, if you just constantly inundate yourself with drama and infighting, then at least my experience, and you can speak for yourself, but what I've seen other people discuss is that it ends up pulling away from the reason why they started talking about politics in the first place, is because they feel like I'm just talking about drama all the time. This is the only thing I'm covering at this point. Like you have people who start as streamers who are like policy wonks, and eventually they're just all talking about interpersonal drama all the time. It
is crazy to see people come in like, I want to talk about this issue, and before you know it, they're just like focusing like completely on drama. Like Chud Logic, I don't even know if he ever talks about politics anymore. And if he's a drama streamer, he's a drama streamer. It is what it is. He's got his market. I got my market.
Sure.
We're all gonna exist, kumbaya, whatever. But he went from like politics most of the time, drama, something like to complete transformation.
Sure.
And I've seen that to lesser extent happen with a lot of content creators who came in thinking they're going to do something totally different.
Yeah.
I never thought I'd be hosting a panel show, but I always kept the foreign policy focus, and I've gone even a little bit further with the foreign policy focus that I originally came in with. I always have tried to keep like some semblance of attachment to IRL politics. That's what I do. But yeah, no, the space, the incentives, the market incentives, the viewership incentives, and the financial and attention rewards, I guess you could say, maybe like the social rewards that come from it are so enticing that it can completely knock you off of what your original streaming plan was.
Yeah, and I mean, like, mind you, this is not to say, like, I'm not making a value judgment saying, like, oh, it's worse or not as good or whatever to do drama content. If that is what fulfills you, if that's what you really want to do, then, like, by all means do it. I just see it as a bit of
But it's not politics.
No, it's not politics. And I see it as a bit of a tragedy where a lot of people are interested in politics principally. That's why they get involved in social media. And because of the incentives that exist on social media platforms, they end up being pushed away from that and being pushed into politics kind of against what they necessarily intend or what they want to do, you know? So I guess going back to your panel, because, you know, you talked about the fact that there is drama on the show and that sometimes that's the most entertaining element, is that there's drama on the show in between people who you'll have on there. How do you go about balancing or kind of navigating having elements of entertainment, usually being drama, but they can be other things? How do you go about navigating that and balancing that so that you're able to keep the conversation still politically relevant?
I think if you have entertainment that intersplices the knowledge to drag in more people, then at the end of the day, even if they're not having as dense of information being injected into their head, having more people, having 10,000 people get 30 minutes of knowledge is better than having 100 people getting 1 hour of knowledge.
Sure.
At least the people can like make the calculation of how much knowledge is getting spread around, whatever. So there's an argument to be made about entertaining people. And so we have done like Hippy Dippies that have been a lot more entertainment, where people had like musical intros, and it was, you know, the people got like awards depending on like how well they did. And we had judges, and some of them were like celebrity Twitch guest judges, and it really did up the production value. We had commentary teams, and we're going to still have commentary teams going forward, because I think it's an interesting way to put people in front of crowds, and it's also an interesting way to keep people entertained as we're trying to change from one debate to another, and it's another way to interact with the audience and stuff like that.
I was asking like how you manage to balance having drama and, you know, meaningful political discussion without having drama overtake it.
There's ways you can do it, but if the conversation is no longer about what the original intended topic was, you're going to lose those people, and you're going to lose like what the show was. If it becomes the drama hour instead of the politics hour, then you can say it's a drama hour and market it as a drama hour, but if you're marketing as a politics show and it just becomes a drama hour every time, then you're mixing up your marketing. You're less likely to, I think, get people who would want to actually have serious political conversations. It's not necessarily always a good look for the show, even if the viewership is good. It's if every once in a while, you know, a CNN interview turns into Jerry Springer and it becomes a big viral clip, that's fine. That's okay. It might even up viewership a little bit in small doses. But if every single scene on CNN is like a Michael Bay movie, then it loses its touch, it loses its shock value, and you're going to have diminishing returns. You're going to have to get crazier and crazier and crazier. And people who would have originally come on and loved your show because it was politics focused are coming in now. It's like, what? Well, this is the Jerry Springer experience. What is this? Why are people throwing rubber chickens at each other? What the? And then they'll go. Like, I don't want to debate incest and the what? I don't want this. Get me out of here. And then you'll never be able to tap into those markets again.
Yeah. As we were talking, you're discussing the sensitivities with maintaining relationships with people of very different political backgrounds and doing that for a panel show. Now, part of this is my own kind of like looking at the space, like a little bit of my own opinion, so feel free to correct me if you have a different one. I feel like over the past couple of years, especially since the time when you decided to retire your show for the time being, I felt like after that show was retired and for a while, a lot of people in the space didn't want to debate each other, whether, you know, for like a number of different reasons. A lot of people who previously were super involved in debate content back super far away. And so I guess I'm interested in your perspective about if that is, you know, if you agree with that assessment, and if you do, why you think that happened.
I think for some people it did. I think it's a combination of factors. I think one, Joe Biden's president. Joe Biden's not Donald Trump. There's not as much entertainment in Donald Trump. And for a lot of lefties, it was kind of like, well, Donald Trump's not in there. Who am I going to go debate with? Do I debate with people criticizing Joe Biden? But I have a lot of critiques of Joe Biden anyway too. And I think some of it was just like the market was not there when it comes to the amount of political commentary that was just being generated and getting viewership online.
Gotcha.
So that's part of it. I think another part of it is that people just got scared of being humiliated. A lot of people got don't like to be on the other end of the got wrecked compilation.
Yeah.
And if you're on the other end of that, those clips can get not just shared around for a little bit, they can get shared around for weeks to years. I mean, sometimes those old like feminist wreck compilations still like end up in my recommended. So depending on how bad you do, it could not only hurt your viewership, if you do bad enough, it hurts your standing within your political movement.
Yeah.
And there's also the ever-present problem of you even having conversations and risking it hurting the movement, isolating you from political allies or people that would be usually like on your side, so to speak. I think some people just got tired of it as well, where they had been doing it video after video and conversation after conversation for so long, and they've had the same conversations and made the same points over and over and over and over again, that they got kind of tired of it. And you get kind of comfortable having the same conversation, saying the same things over. You're like pressing the same button combinations. And if you just do that over and over and over again, yeah, you're going to get kind of bored if you don't expand a new horizon or try to develop an expertise in something else so you can maybe talk about that or provide new perspectives. You got to keep building on yourself if you want to keep providing something new to your audience. Because if you just make the same points over and over and over again, people are going to stop viewing. And so for those people who got lazy, people did stop viewing, combined with the bad market. And it provided like, oh, what's the reward I'm getting out of this?
Yeah.
People kind of engage in a lot of fortress arcing over this time period. But now it's election season. Markets, I would say, are up. There's more examples of these shows out there succeeding on mainstream entertainment like Piers Morgan. And if it's succeeding there, I have no reason to believe that it couldn't also succeed out here as well. People seem to be more interested in having these conversations. Since we've started doing Hippy Dippy again, we haven't even advertised it that much. This week we're really going to, I think, start pushing it tonight because tonight's Monday and it's this Friday. And people are coming up from all its different emails and messages saying, hey, I want to be involved in this way, that way, including people who were retired from the Twitch space for like a better part of a year, 2 years, so that are just wanting to come back to engage with it again because there's not a lot of places like Hippy Dippy to have these conversations in our space. So I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. It reminds me, a bit of what you said reminds me of something that Natalie mentioned when I had my interview with her. She brought up a really interesting bit of wisdom that, especially on social media, every opinion is an opportunity to be hated.
The easier thing to do is to say nothing about anything. Every post sometimes every time I post on social media, it sometimes feels like, why am I posting? A post is just an opportunity to be hated, you know?
Yes.
And so it's like, why am I doing this? It's like, well, because sometimes it's worth being hated, right? Some people obviously will see me as like a villain, but some people will also see that I'm attempting to do the best that I can in this situation. And will that ever be good enough? No, because no one's perfect. But, you know, I'm making a good faith effort. And on the issues where wielding a large platform is likely to actually have some kind of impact, that's what I try to like notice what those things are. I think that, you know, presidential elections are kind of an obvious one.
Yeah.
Where like telling 1.5 million people or whatever to vote a certain way probably has some kind of impact.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, a responsibility to do it.
That makes a lot of sense. It's funny because I think that you actually took the words out of my mouth. I think I arrived at the same conclusion that like every opinion is an opportunity for someone to hate you, right? And that makes it really hard because it means that you could try to be as reasonable as possible, but like most people are not prepared for when you say something that you personally feel like is relatively benign, regardless of whether or not it is. But if you say something that you feel like is relatively benign, and then someone responds and says that you're the most awful, hateful, whatever person possible, it messes with your head.
Yeah, and this is not unique to politics by any means, by the way. Like, I know a lot of people who discuss media on YouTube or on social media, and if you say you think a movie is bad, there will be people who will be offended by that to their core.
Yeah. And
who will come for you with the intensity of any political disagreement. So it's not just politics, right? I think some, like, in recent times, like some of the most like intense like hate storms I've brought upon myself have been like opinions about a movie I just saw in a tweet that I spent 20 seconds writing because it didn't occur to me that this was going to cause a lot of people to get very upset.
Yeah.
So yes, you do kind of get used to this idea that, you know, everything you say is going to upset someone.
But it really pushes this idea that like you just shouldn't say anything at all.
Right. Well, it makes you want to say less, and so you do say less. And I
Mhm.
say much, much less than I used to about everything.
Yeah.
Right? I think I'm posting less frequently. What I do post is tends to be much more cautious and reserved.
Mm.
You know, if I have some like controversial, edgy opinion, you know, unless I'm like drunk and it's 2 a.m., I'm not tweeting that.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that like that really stuck with me. I thought about that a little bit before, but it stuck with me a lot after because I think that's one of those things where most people don't really think about that if you're not very on social media, especially if you're not like operating as kind of an influencer in this space, right? Because for the most part, you can go around day-to-day life and like if you express an opinion to like your family member or whatever, for the most part, I think that most people can say like, okay, well, I either don't care that much or I'm not going to care enough to disagree, or even if I do disagree, like whatever, it's a difference of political opinion. I don't think that most people hold substantive disagreements that hard against
But if
each
you're
other.
one of those people, you're not going to be the ones to race the replies either.
Yeah, but that's the thing, right? Like if you're very online, not only are influencers much more aware of what other people are saying about them and what people are, you know, saying in response to them, but there's also the element where what, you know, especially the larger you get on social media, it's almost just an inevitability that some number of people are going to disagree with you. You could say that 1 + 1 = 2 on social media. There will be people in your replies, if you're a big enough content creator, trying to argue, oh, you're actually, you're fucking stupid or whatever, right? And calling you all sort of mean things. And the big thing from Natalie's conversation that I took from her, and a big reason why I see that she has posted less and less and less, is because like for her especially, and I think this is true for everyone, it becomes every engagement becomes a greater risk-benefit calculation, right? It's like, is what I'm about to say worth it to me personally enough that I will be able to withstand all of the possible harassment or pushback or whatever I'm going to get as a consequence of putting this out there, of putting this opinion out there, right? And so at least for me personally, I've way scaled back the amount of opinions I express on social media because, like, for the most part, a lot of the stuff that I think about even saying, I'm like, well, it's not worth the possible harassment I'm going to get or the possible pushback or whatever. And as a consequence, I've, you know, like one of the big things that came from that is like fundamentally shifting how I do content. But I see streamers, and especially a tight bind, dealing with that because you're always opining on things. You're always going to get
and you're
pushback.
live, and when you're live, if you say something like, I don't even know about that, it's hard to backtrack and not look like, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, I think about streamers who are on for like 4, 5, 6, 7 hours a day, basically five plus days a week, constantly opining on things, and it's like, yeah, no wonder you all are necessarily
talk about.
Yeah, no wonder you all are inevitably going to get into fights with each other. Like sometimes I'll you know, look at the space and like I'm not gonna name names, but like I see that there's people who are like super hardcore like aligned as like, oh yeah, like these people are basically considered together like a couple years ago, and nowadays they're all going at each other's throats because like yeah, like when you're constantly opining on things and you're constantly looking for stuff to talk about, it seems like an inevitability with that model that it seems almost certain that you're going to eventually end up fighting with people. And so that just seems like, I don't know. It's why I'm not like, personally not as passionate. I'm not going to tell people not to do streaming because obviously it, you know, it does work for some people and some people are able to do it for like years and years. I think again of some people like Destiny, where he's done it for literally longer than anybody else.
Yeah, but people like Destiny also have other stuff that they've done on streams, like video games and stuff like that. I do 4 to 6 hours of political content. That's hard to do every day. There's a lot of you needing to find content to react to.
Yeah.
You have to do it, or you're just not going to be able to fill that time slot. I can do like 3 hours of news, usually max, and to fill out that last 2 to 3 hours, I usually react to some conversation and opine on it. Yeah. I mean, that's how most people seem to be able to fill up that time. Or we play video games, but most people who want to talk about politics don't want to see video games, and your viewership drops, and it causes, you know, panic on the political streamer, and then they just check back, straight back into doing politics. And if they, I mean, the only way you'd be able to build up enough so you could play video games consistently is if you make a separate channel, or you do it again and again and again enough so some people come along for that as well. But that takes time, investment, and an inevitable hit in the viewership. And so
Yeah.
a lot of people just focus on the politics, and it's hard to do that long for politics.
Yeah. And so and especially like taking this back to your unique issue, because that's just like streaming politics in general, right? You deal with streaming politics and hosting debates between people, which, you know, take all the issues that we talked about and then put that all in a live setting where you're dealing with 1+ other people who are known to, you know, disagree with you at the front end, right? Like, it's just going to magnify these issues like tenfold at the start. And so it makes sense to me from that perspective, like why from just like a risk-benefit analysis perspective that many people would say like, oh, I don't want to do that. So I guess from your perspective, I'm curious, since you are bringing it back, how you're able to kind of overcome that, how you make the pitch to people to get involved, and how you can convince some of these people, oh, actually it is worthwhile to do this, even if it is, from the perspective that we discussed, a risky move to do.
Well, I mean, some people, honestly, just need to be given enough reward. Because there are people that we've invited that say they don't do these types of conversations, like, for example, George Santos, who then went on to do, like, Piers Morgan shows anyway. So a lot of times the people who say that they won't do it, or, oh, they don't do these kind of debates anymore, it's just a question of, like, making the carrot big enough.
Gotcha.
So either offering them a big enough person to debate, a large enough audience, which is harder for me to provide because I'm not Piers Morgan, obviously.
Sure.
But one of those two things, you need to offer them a bigger carrot. For some people, just being blatantly honest. For others, I think like selling the point of you want to go out there and make your side. If you truly believe in these ideas, you want to make the case to people who don't agree with you. You want to be able to sharpen your rhetoric, and these types of shows can help you sharpen your rhetoric. It can help you make your case to people. You can get really good clips. You can reuse the stream and post it in full, or clip it up and post those clips everywhere. It's not the worst for actually building relationships, because I know a lot of people who met on Hippy Dippy and then went off to do their own thing afterwards. And now it's even easier than ever to get involved in Hippy Dippy, because before we did 3.5-hour long shows and we were able to book really big guests. Now the shows are going to be, for each debate, like an hour, hour and a half, making it a lot easier for us to get people who traditionally would not sign up for a show as long. So it's less investment. You get interconnectivity with the people that you get to go on with, both on the left wing and right wing side. So you could either do more content like this in the future with them, or content completely separate. Like if I'm at Lonerbox here on one of these shows, I could go off and do like a video essay with him. You get exposed to the audience from Hippy Dippy, so you do get some exposure. You get potential clips, the VOD. I think there's enough benefits for somebody to want to do this, especially if the counterance, and this is always the big thing, the people you're debating or the topics you're debating, if it's the right topic at the right moment, the viewership's going to be much better. And if it's the right opponent, i.e. a really big streamer like Destiny or Vosh, etc., then that can also be extremely beneficial for you as well, and is not just going to be beneficial for my show. So there are people who did get help gain sizable followings from Hippy Dippy, and were able to build them up to some extent, especially if they are able to make their moment in one of these shows, which of course that's dependent on them and their performance. I cannot guarantee anybody that they're not going to face plant. I'm not going to rig it for anybody and be like, we're going to make you look dumb this and that way, or I'm going to make him look dumb this and that way. But if you do make your moment, it can really benefit you. Yeah.
No, I definitely get that. I think that even going back to the point that we made earlier, I think that, you know, I like the points about like giving you
that, and we're not even talking about the people who are going to react to the debate and then their community see it too, which gives it more spread.
Yeah, and you know, like, and I like that in terms of exposure. I think that the other element, and mind you, like this is going to vary based on what your actual internal motivations are. I'm sure that there are like some number of political commentators, whether they're the majority of political content creators or the minority or whatever, I can't say. But there's some number of people who probably don't actually care as much about convincing other people, so this isn't as much for them. But I think that there's something to be said, like, if you do really care about your political message and actually trying to convince other people who aren't already predisposed to agree with you, there is something to be said about, like, going against opponents, even if it's possible that they're acting in bad faith, probably likely, depending on the conversation.
But much of conversation in the world is bad faith. These bad faith points are being made with or without my show going on. And so people, even if it is bad faith, there might even be a point that it might be more important to know how to engage with something that's bad faith, because if something's bad faith, it's much more difficult for somebody to engage with it on a day-to-day basis than a question in good faith or a question that's, you know, made to be accessible for a person to answer. But if it's a bad faith question, helping to show people the tools to disarm that landmine is useful.
Yeah, like I think about, I feel like, so, you know, two elements to that. I feel like it's very useful to the point that you made, regardless of whether or not someone with a disagreeing political opinion is engaging in good or bad faith, to engage with them, because, yeah, it gives you the opportunity to sharpen your skills, to figure out how to actually navigate that conversation with someone who probably does know the relevant talking points, so that if you ever talk to someone who is acting in good faith and who actually could be moved, you know how to navigate that conversation. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, I think that it goes to, you know, trying to deliver to the streamers or to the viewers what they really want. And mind you, like, some of this is speculation, but I believe that viewers don't really just want to hear the same thing said over and over and over again on live streams. Like, if you watch a streamer, presumably you're going to be more interested in listening to them actually tackle more meaty, more complicated arguments, because, like, if you hear the same thing over and over and over again, at least from a personal perspective, that's not going to be really interesting or very useful. Exactly. But, you know, like, so if you want to have really interesting content, I feel like as a streamer, it means that you're necessarily going to have to eventually tackle some pretty meaty or pretty significant opponents, like opponents who know what they're talking about, at least enough to be able to have an informed conversation, or like on the...
This is what always gets me about, and this is a weakness of a lot of the conservative right big commentators, the big talking heads, is they avoid, a lot of times, just being blunt, the more difficult conversations for the easier conversations. The college schoolboy who's all been hyped up after a few reading sessions of Marxist thought and is going to go talk to the person who's been knocking down mostly college-age children again and again and again.
I'll wholeheartedly, like, I just don't get how those people are able to get a massive viewing, to the extent that there are, you know, channels out there who do that.
Because they're knocking down the image of the left and of the, you can say, uneducated college young guy who thinks he knows everything because he read like a few books or a few titles of articles. He's knocking down the image that they have of what the left or what the organized Democrat or whatever the opponent is in their head.
But I feel like
it's the same reason why people like the feminist freakout compilations are so good. It's not because there's a bunch of like good points being made here about like the wage gap, or there's a bunch of good points here made about whatever contraceptive use. It's because it's easy to not like somebody who's yelling and screaming at the camera, and it's easy to shake your head at somebody who's very clearly ignorant.
Yeah, I mean, like, I get that. I guess I just am a little bit, like, this is just like an entirely personal, I just don't understand how a viewer who consumes a lot of that content can find it interesting.
I don't personally. I understand the like feeling of superiority that could be built, or like laughing at somebody for being stupid, or being like, oh, I'm correct, oh, our side got like a victory. I can understand it. I just don't feel that. I just don't really get much out of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get that, but like, so to the other point I was going to make, like, I feel like, so for streamers, I feel like it ends up, and maybe maybe this is just strictly talking from a left-leaning perspective. It's not like I've consumed at any point like any right-leaning content or a streamer or whatever. But like from a left-leaning content, I'm only ever typically like super invested in streamers who have those kind of conversations, or content creator, or like a video essayist, for example, who are able to strongly represent the opposing side, right? Like, you know, if there's like a video essayist who's like, here's the opposing argument, and also it's bad and stupid, and you know, they just do like a poor job representing it, then it's like, okay, well, you're not going to be super interesting, because like at the front end of the gate, I already know that you're not really addressing what the other side is saying, right? Like, it's just not going to be like that substantive of a conversation. Whereas like I look at Natalie, and people can disagree about whether or not she does a good job at this. I think she does, where it seems like she does make genuine efforts to try and represent the other perspective, even if she ends up disagreeing with it, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. So that would be like my other sell for, you know, at least streamers to get more involved with debate content and content like what you're doing, because I think that it's just like legitimately, at least to me, what's more interesting. But anyway, yeah. So going back, I think that we alluded to this a little bit at the beginning, that you stopped Hippy Dippy for a while, and that you're going to be bringing it back. So could you talk a little bit about why you decided to retire it for a time, and then what motivated you to bring it back?
I decided to retire it for a few reasons. Number one, I went to Ukraine and I was working on documenting the war as a war journalist, filming with artillery crews, drone crews, infantrymen, like people from all across the country in different locations. And both due to my location, it made it difficult to have a consistent schedule on doing Hippy Dippy, and consistency is key if you want to have these shows weekly or bi-weekly. And that was one problem. Another problem was that I was getting the same guests, the same people, a lot of times talking about the same topics. And you can deal with talking about the same topics. You can even deal with having some of the same people. But once you're doing both again and again and again, and you're not getting a lot of new blood, or all the new blood we were getting were like 3, 4, 5 viewership Andes that had not gone through like the Hippy Dippy recruitment system and like figured out how to really make their way yet. And it was just too long until we were going to see those people like really come around. I think Pondering Politics was still like, I don't think it was a 5 viewership Andy, but it was like that. So to give you an idea of just how much it has changed, because he's grown so much since then. I'm really happy for him.
Yeah.
But I think that combined with just bad market, like people were not watching it as much as they used to, and the effort I would need to make to improve the show, to make it so I think people would watch it, I just didn't have the time to because of my war journalism. And so all these things came together to make me put the show on what was basically a permanent hiatus until now that I've seen the conditions have changed, and now that I've gotten my foot on the ground in Ukraine and I have an idea of what I'm doing, I can now maybe start it again with a different schedule, at least through the election. We'll see how well it goes. We'll then reconsider it after the election. But I also just didn't want to keep doing something if it wasn't going to improve, or if it was going to teeter off, even if it made money, because I just don't want to watch it slowly rot and then ruin the image people had of the show in their head for the people who genuinely liked it and cared about it and tuned in every week. The people who made up Hippy Dippy and made the show possible.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really respect that. I think that there's something to be said, like, even if people aren't necessarily happy with the project retiring, I think it is, on the whole, better to retire a project on a high note than to carry it on and, like, let it slowly dwindle away into nothing. Now, that's not to say that if you really believe in the project that you shouldn't keep at it and keep working on it if you, like, genuinely believe that it has, like, a bright future. But, I mean, like, I respect the decision to retire it and bring it back when you feel like the conditions are in a better position for it. So, no, I like that. You've talked a bit. Let's change the subject. You've talked a bit throughout this about your war journalism in Ukraine. And I've mentioned before about how I think that that is incredibly impressive as far as work that you've done. So talk a little bit about what, at a high level, what that work has involved, how you got started with it, and what was your motivation to begin that work?
When you say at a high level, what do you mean by that? Like
a high, just give people who are watching like a high, like war journalism could mean a million things. At a high level, like what does that actually mean?
So what I do specifically, because war journalism could mean a lot of things. It could mean you're just interviewing civilians in Lviv about what it's like to be a displaced person. That's journalism about the war. People who are doing OSCENT work in the United States, going and looking at different satellite photographs of planes and air bases in Russia, trying to count how many they have. That can be journalism. So there's a lot of different ways you can do war journalism, even when you're not near the war zone. But I wanted, due to the war starting, I had to focus on foreign policy. I was focusing on, Syria and a lot of other conflicts. But when the war started, I got very invested. I would even say emotionally enamored to some degree, and I think I still am. And I saw the war happening, and there were two things that were bothering me. The first thing is that while I was getting a lot of viewership and I was making a decent amount of money, I didn't know what to do with this money to improve the show. Whether I should invest in a studio here or go on the ground to improve the coverage. And I wanted to improve the coverage because, again, why keep doing something if you can't continue to improve it? I don't just want to go in the same cycles forever and ever and ever. And I think the other thing that was really bothering me is that there was a lot of people pushing disinformation, and I wanted there to be more sources on the ground that we could pull from to see what's actually happening. I wanted to show what was actually happening. So I wanted to improve my coverage. I wanted to show what was actually happening, and I really wanted to battle the disinformation scourge that has been a major problem during this war, during the war in Gaza, even the war in Sudan and the war in Myanmar. I mean, misinformation is a major scourge right now. And I think that a lot of people are investing in fact-checking, when I think a big investment that needs to be made is making sure that there's more on-the-ground sources that are working on confirming stories and going out and recording individual instances. Because if somebody goes out and says, for example, there's a lot of rumors or a lot of conspiracy theories about Assad gassing his own people. He did, but people deny that he gassed his own people. And I think that because we have all these other instances of Assad gassing his own people, instead of like having like, you know, all this time just concentrating on in this one specific instance that Assad gassed his own people, we could just be, because there's all this other reporting and work that other people have done and the UN has monitored, we just be like, here's the other like dozens of instances of his gassing his own people. Somebody makes a conspiracy theory about Bucha, we're like, okay, we know Bucha happened, we can show the evidence, but what about the 20, 30 other massacres? And I think that by having the overwhelming, undeniable evidence, like it's like with the Holocaust, they filmed it, the evidence was so overwhelming that it put the disinformation actors on the worst footing possible. Journalism is the first draft in history, and if you don't have that good first draft, then people are going to start scribbling on the notes.
No, that's fascinating. I really appreciate the consideration of responding to dis or misinformation. Regarding your motivation to gather to respond to disinformation on social media, I really appreciate that because I feel like a lot of people, and again, I'm talking from my own bias, but from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of a lot of left-leaning content creators, they see a lot of conservative content creators and feel that they are spreading misinformation on social media, and they see it as their mission to try and combat that to the extent that they reasonably can. But that can be hard when ultimately, if you're only working with sources on the internet, you're not going out and collecting actual evidence, like, and mind you, that's hard to do. It is hard to collect actual evidence for emerging political issues. But if you don't, or sorry, like hard, trustworthy evidence, right? Sometimes people will go out and find like anecdotes to support what they want to believe and say like, oh, this is representative of every example. I'm not talking about that. Like, you know, what you're doing, I feel like, is actually going out and collecting like hard, relevant, trustworthy evidence on relevant issues. And that is so hard to do for the vast majority of content creators. And so, yeah, I just think it's really impressive what you've been able to do with that. And especially because like very few people are going to be incentivized to do that, because like that shit is dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, it's not always as dangerous to collect direct evidence. Like you can do scientific experiments or whatever in like in other fields. But this particularly, yeah, it comes with danger. But if there's not a camera and a journalist there, a lot of times the best you're going to get are like GoPros or like secondhand testimony, and people are going to talk about, you know, the bias, and the bias will always exist to some degree. If you're choosing your camera frame, you're choosing your bias. You're choosing like, this is more important, so let's focus on this. But with the people who are directly being affected being the ones, or the people directly being shelled being the ones reporting it, that necessarily isn't always like enough. And of course, there's always accusations of lying, and there's a lot of deceptive imagery persuasion. This is where people will show like a clip of a video to try to show one thing, but then the whole video would show something totally different. And that's happened. The Russians have tried to do that on stories that I've covered before, showing like only like images to be like, this is what really happened, but they didn't show the full thing, not showing like certain war crimes that they've committed. So it's important to have on the ground sources for when they do this, so you can have different camera angles, because they'll choose what angle the story is told if there's nobody else to show the different angles.
All right, so you discussed a little bit about deceptive imagery persuasion. So do you have any relevant examples where you were dealing with that while you've been engaging in this project?
Yeah, like that story I was working on. I was in Kherson 2 days after the Russians blew up the Novokakhovka Dam. It was this dam that was holding up tons of flood water and was generating power, and it was destroyed. And the vast majority of evidence points towards the Russians doing it, and it caused floodwaters. It hasn't been 100% confirmed, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming. The floodwaters then rushed downstream, and it swept away a lot of homes. A lot of elderly people and disabled people drowned in their homes. I think the environmental minister of Ukraine said about 30,000 animals were killed, a lot of homes destroyed. And within 48 hours of the dam blowing up, the Russians started shelling the city center of Kherson. Now, Kherson was a city they controlled, but they were pushed out of. Some people might say it's revenge. Some people might say that it was an attempt to target legitimate military targets. But what I know from being there is that a lot of aid workers were hurt, and that a lot of aid workers were blown up. Before I even got in the city, I was interacting with a press officer, and he was having soldiers like beat on my body armor to make sure that it was strong enough to even allow me into a city of 400,000 people, because they were just hitting different areas of the city, sometimes in the city center, sometimes in the outskirts, pretty randomly. And so that was already a problem I was running into. And I know the chief rabbi of Ukraine, he was shelled while he was doing aid work there. I know a friend I met named Yannick, he was showing me his head injuries. I can send you the photos of that. I met homeless people on the street that had gouging head wounds just walking around with that.
Oh my God.
And just like his head held together by like just straps because they were like of cloth, just because they were shelling the city randomly during the aid operation to rescue these people. And the aid operation was done very haphazardly. They didn't have the infrastructure in place. They didn't have the people. So a lot of locals got involved. A lot of locals gave their boats, and a lot of foreign volunteers who kind of just like came in and flooded in. And so I was filming a German aid team that had come to specifically like help with animals, and we had set up a animal shelter with UA animals the night before. And these were some interesting cats. Like one was like training to do a marathon while like between aid missions he would jump rope. Very like energetic, we want to help the world type Europeans.
Yeah.
And my friend John Jones, who was an elderly British expat who actually just went back to Ukraine, which is crazy considering the story. They were going to go out on the water on the river, and the Ukrainians are on one side, the Russians on the other, to go get these people who were drowning in their homes, try to get the cats and the dogs and everything out, do an aid operation. And we had heard reports that the Russians were shelling the area with tank fire. And when we went out and put the boat out on the water, somebody did not do us well and gave us a boat that did not work. It couldn't start on the water, and as they dragged it back to the water side, the Russians started shelling the aid operation.
Oh my
My
God.
friend John Jones, he got hit in the stomach, he hit the floor, and as a 60-something-year-old man, obviously going towards the 70s, you know, that's it was difficult for him to get off.
Yeah.
They targeted first with a smaller millimeter mortar, then expanded to, I believe, about an 80 millimeter mortar. They decimated the boat. I was supposed to be on that boat, but I didn't get to be on it because they were one too many people on the boat. And so if I got on it, I was supposed to be on the boat. I wasn't. I ran to a bunker that the police told us to go into, and they were really, like, they emphasized it a lot. Like, if anything bad happens, go into this bunker. If anything bad happens, go into this bunker. Go over to the bunker, pull on the door. The bunker's locked.
We need to go inside. We need to go inside. It's locked. Motherfucker. They tell me there's one bunker, and then if shelling starts, to go over to that bunker door, and then I go over to the door and it's locked. The one instruction I was given, and it didn't protect me.
So I just hide between buildings as they're shelling the area,
No.
hoping the shells don't fall in between the buildings because then it'll ricochet and it'll turn me into Swiss cheese.
Oh my
But
God.
we couldn't get in the bunker, so I do that while the rest of them on the shoreline run to the bunker. Eventually, my friend Dima, who I just released a documentary about, drags John Jones into the bunker.
I managed to get out, and the next thing I was aware of was a burning pain in my side. I looked down and I saw fresh tissue from an obvious wound.
He was bleeding pretty badly.
I thought, oh shit, please, survive, John, please.
We'll get him into the hospital. I know that's a lot of details, but it's all to say that the next day, when the Germans left, because they were shaken, because, you know, this was the first time they had a close call like that. I go to visit John Jones in the hospital, and as I'm talking to him and I'm making sure he's okay and that he has transportation, it was a hospital in Odessa, I get a message from my friend in Kiev, and he's like, yo, Dylan, is this your boat that you guys were on in this video? And he sends me a video from a private, like a drone group that works for a private military company owned by the head of the occupation in Crimea, Aksionov. And the video is playing hard rock music, singing "We're the Gods of War" as they bombed the boats that we were in. Just one after the other after the other, and they show the smoldering rubble. And they put in the captions beneath it, Ukrainian special forces were going to use these boats to develop a bridgehead on the other side of the river. And by doing this, they had destroyed these Azov soldiers and we had, saved Russia and stopped the counteroffensive, yada yada, they hear us.
The next day, while everyone was still rattled by the previous day's events, Dylan and Alex were visiting John in the hospital when Dylan was texted a video.
Me and Alex Bartaway went to the hospital to visit John. He was pretty messed up, but he was in safe condition. And when we were talking to him and about to head out from the hospital, I get a text message from my buddy, from my good friend in Kiev. And it's a video that was very obviously the boat that we were using the day before, the red boat. And there was the white boat next to it, and it was on the exact shoreline. It was us, that was us, the aid workers on the shoreline, and it was from the perspective of a Russian drone with a rune often used by the Nazis in the top left-hand corner, and they were playing rock music as they shelled us on video. And then they posted this online with a message about us being special forces trying to build a bridgehead on the other side of the river. It was absolutely ridiculous. It was surreal. It was kind of hard to process. It was probably the most shocking part of the entire trip.
The video in question was posted on the Disgusting 8 Telegram channel, the social media channel for drone and artillery support elements attached to the Levity Battalion, a private military company owned by Sergei Aksionov. Aksionov is the head of the Crimean Occupation Authority and was installed in 2014 after Russian forces invaded and occupied the Crimean Regional Parliament building. Aksionov's Levity Battalion are officially designated as reservists and formalized as the 30th Combat Army Reserve. The group also cooperates with the Russian Army's 150th Motorized Rifle Division and 205th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. Members of the Levity Battalion were made to sign a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense under the Combat Army Reserve program, and with PMC Convoy, a company consisting of reconnaissance and assault units led by Wagnerite Konstantin Pikolov.
What the fuck? Also, congratulations on your promotion to Ukrainian Special Forces.
Yeah, Ukrainian Azov Special Forces.
Yeah, no, I didn't know that you put in all the work for that. That's wild to hear.
Yeah. I'm surprised I could. I mean, I can only do how many pull-ups, and they let me in that?
I'm sorry, I shouldn't joke about it. That is insane. That is actually fucking crazy. Yep. But that goes to your point about spreading misinformation or disinformation. That like, that's clear. Like that's just not what happened.
That's not what happened.
That's not what happened.
But since I knew everybody. I gathered the testimony. We filmed. Me and my friend Anthony Bartaway, we did the work to like gather all of this, and with offbeat research, we were able to present. Here's the GoPro footage on the ground. Here's, you can see the sound of the whistle where the direction the stuff's coming from.
Yeah.
Here's us placing the location. Here's evidence that I filmed before of them doing aid work and like, animal shelters, them loading it up with aid supplies, no military gear. We could connect the people. And we were able to bring on a international law analyst to talk, like obviously why bombing aid workers is a war crime.
Yeah.
And so it was I would say probably is the best, most documented, thorough documentation of Russian shelling of aid workers during that flooding. There's other instances where aid workers got shelled, but it's from the perspective of the aid workers either filming themselves or you see the injuries afterwards. So we were able to help at least a little bit build the case against the people who committed those targeting of aid workers, the war crimes.
I'm glad you're okay. Shit. That's awful to hear. I mean, like, well, elements. To your point about, like, being able to respond to the disinformation that was being spread, that is wonderful. That sounds like the perfect way to be able to respond to that. Like, what are they going to say? Like, they can't dispute the evidence that you're presenting. It sounds like it would be ironclad. Like, they would basically have to go out and call you a liar. And based on, if you have recordings and testimony from several other, like the other people who were there, then there's really nothing that can be said about that, at least I can think of.
They just, and there was people, I was looking at the Telegram posts who were posting all this information in the replies, like, oh my. Hey, like, look, you guys just bombed aid workers. Great job, morons. And they're just like, they just ignore it. They just like ignore it. And they just kind of like, and that's the only way you can, because if you acknowledge that you lied, then that could shake the faith that your viewership have in you.
Yeah.
So the hope is that people just don't see the replies, people don't see the original, and I advertise to an English-speaking audience, so it would only be dependent upon people translating it into Ukrainian and Russian, a lot of this work, for them to be able to understand this. So a lot of times it's language divides that stop some of that information being spread around, because it will be good English language reporting, but it isn't translated.
Sure.
But Google Translate and stuff like that has been helping with that, help proliferating the information.
That is good. It's just, I mean, it's awful. I mean, like, I'm glad that you're okay. I'm glad that you are able to present that information and be able to talk about this to the world. But, like, fuck. Yeah. You mentioned a little bit we can talk about that more if you want to. But I also know that you talked a little bit about Dima, and I know that's a person that you did a lot of work with, and that you've done a lot of work with over in Ukraine, and that you recently released a special about them.
Released a documentary called The Unevacuatables.
И вот так я, сначала вот такая была эвакуация. Сколько привез топлива, столько вот колонн я его вот так прямо с побитыми машинами, без стекол, без дверей. Люди вот так в очках, на таких лыжных. Это было смешно. Едем на ободе. Дима не сдается. Опасная зона, приходится выезжать. Нема времени менять колесо. Очень опасно. Дима наперед.
Which, by the way, isn't a real word, but that also means I have monopoly on the advertising. So
yeah,
okay.
There you
and
go.
Plus, unvacuable. Does that sound as fun? It doesn't sound as good. I think unevacuatables. No. I think has a better ting to it.
Sure.
Sure. Okay. Sure.
All right. Listen. Well,
sure.
You will, in theory, you'll be like you'll be writing the Google. If people like search for you, you'll be like in the first search results. So there you have that going for you.
He was. He's an interesting guy. He's kind of a, he's from Dnipro, and he's like a lot of people from Dnipro. He's a party guy. He liked to get in a lot of fights back in the day. He's trying to use faith to try to improve himself, but he's a Dnipro party guy, which a lot of people from Dnipro, people from Ukraine know what that means, but
sure.
He's an interesting fella. He's a fun guy.
Yeah.
And somebody you would not imagine to be an aid worker or an evacuation worker, given what's going on in the country. But when the war started, he ended up evacuating people from Mariupol, a lot of people from Mariupol. Not just Mariupol, but from Svetohirsk and other locations around Bakhmut and at other of the big hot spots all across the country. That's documented. And when he saved my friend John Jones, helped save him, drag him from the shoreline, we had interviewed him for the Kherson piece that we eventually released. And my friend who was translating it came to me and said, Dylan, this guy's crazy. You gotta interview this guy. You gotta do a piece about this guy. And then I started asking other people about him and learned more and more and more about him.
Sure.
And so then I decided I was gonna embed with him, film what his experiences are like, take all of this original footage from his time in Mariupol and all these other locations, publish as much of it as we can, and try to talk about his story. Not only because he's kind of crazy and he's had a lot of crazy experiences, not only because he's evacuated a lot of people, but he is somebody who was raised in a Russian-speaking household. He was sent to Russian school, even though the Ukrainian school was closer. His parents made sure he went to a Russian-speaking school. His father fought in Afghanistan and Chechnya. This is somebody that was supposed to be like the prime candidate for like the Ruski Mir, like the Russian world coming in to like open their arms. And yet these are the people that are left picking up the pieces. Those who have felt the most pain and damage in this war are in areas that are largely Russian-speaking. It is in eastern Ukraine where the largest concentration of Russian speakers are, which is who the Russians said they were coming to liberate and free, and that's where the majority of the destruction, the majority of the death, the majority of civilian casualties, the majority of all of the damage that this war has caused is, which is an interesting dilemma for those who are talking about, uniting and helping the quote-unquote Russian peoples, the brotherly nations, for those who still believe that in Russia.
From what I understand, like a lot of the talking, or one of the talking points I hear from the pro-Russia side is that like, oh, this is Russia going in and like reclaiming people who, want to be a part of Russia. Yeah. Right. And from what you're describing, it sounds like this would be like the primary candidate of a person who would be in favor of like reuniting with Russia. And mind you, like pursuant to what I said earlier, like I'm not one to make like a massive prescription based on anecdote, but like it is interesting that you have a person so strongly going against that tide to the point where they're even trying to help evacuate other people out of there. And
it's the thing that's interesting though is because of Dima's background, he can communicate to people who are in these communities in a way that I think others can't. And because he has that experience within like the cultural length, the cultural arms of the Russian world, he can communicate to people who have been living in these communities and try to talk to them for those who are actually waiting for the Russian army. Because those people do exist. I met them. Okay. They're largely elderly. They largely live like either in occupied territory or in frontline communities. They don't make up a majority of any of the villages or the cities I've gone to. What's happened is like 90 to 95% of the city is left, and the 5% that is left, 40 or 30% of that is going to be made up of people who are waiting for the Russian army to come. And the rest are maybe people who like have always lived in that village and have never wanted to leave because they could never imagine living anywhere else. Everything they own is in that village, and if they give it up, then they literally have lost everything. They've got the children in that village. They don't get enough pensions from the government, and so the idea of moving to Kiev, where it's going to be like $300, $400 a month for rent, if you're getting a decent, like a smaller apartment maybe, that's going to be difficult for somebody who's only getting like $150 a month from the government. So there's other problems, but for those who are actually there waiting, he can talk to them in a way, and he talks about constantly in this documentary that I'm not supposed to be biased. I'm supposed to be unbiased. My main goal is life. Life is more precious than gold. Life. And so we got to film him debating people who refuse to leave, fighting to try to get them out. And that's the pinnacle of the documentary, is him debating the waiters, the people who refuse to leave. And it's, I think, the most interesting part of the documentary.
Родненькая, что вы тут? Как у вас дела? Я справа. Когда уже на эвакуацию?
Я на эвакуацию не могу.
Чего?
У меня сына здесь.
Да?
Да, я сына не брошу.
Ну, давайте я вам визиточку дам. Вдруг что-то поменяется. Жилье и питание есть в Днепре. Бесплатно. На неограниченный срок. Вместе со всеми. С сыном. Поняли? Все. Так что не переживайте.
Так, если сына, так он боится, что его в армию водить, а он не подлежит армейке, он
Нет,
даже нету
в армию никто не возьмет, все нормально, сын пускай не переживает, мы его эвакуируем, на блокпостах не забирают в армию, все нормально, пускай просто не переживает, мы его вывезем, потому что выезжать можно, поняли? Вот так и передайте, если что, звоните, хорошо?
Хорошо,
все.
Спасибо, очень.
Я вам, знаете, что могу сказать? Вы хорошо выглядите. Для вот этих обстоятельств вы шикарно выглядите, родненькая наша.
Мне 70 лет, а я выгляжу на 75.
Кто вам сказал? Я думал, вам 52 где-то, а вы тут 70.
Смотрите, все, цветовая гамма подобрана, красивая.
Модница наша.
Конечно.
Все, звоните, если что.
Главное, что обход делаете.
Главное, что все целы. Это самое главное, слава богу.
Because there are not many conversations like that translated. There's not many videos of conversations like that at all because of how private that type of conversation is. That's why we have to keep the actual identity of the waiter secret. But also, it's certainly not translated into English media. That's not a conversation that is very comfortable, and so it's not often touched upon this directly or shown like this. It's only talked about like by secondhand people. They never show you the perspective of those who stay. Yeah, no, I believe that. I mean, like, you know, for as much as this is something that is a highly politicized issue, it's very difficult, you know, in a general level, but especially regarding this, to be able to find meaningful conversations among people who are most directly affected in politics. Those are rare in general, right? And especially for a war in Ukraine, where most people in the U.S. are going to be very removed. For most people in the U.S., the war in Ukraine is still like a very abstract issue, right? It doesn't directly affect most of them on a personal day-to-day level. But it seems like a very worthwhile thing. I guess this is the place where, you know, if you want to plug it, but from my perspective... The Unevacuatables. You can watch it for free on YouTube. There you go. But from my perspective, it seems like something that is really useful for people. Yeah, like I feel like having those kind of conversations among people who are directly affected by really pressing political issues are probably some of the most important. So yeah, that's amazing that you're able to collect that. So Dylan, related to the discussion on Ukraine, I guess one thing I'm interested in, because I'm thinking about, I was just recently playing Fallout, you know, I was thinking about the adage, war never changes, right?
Yeah. It's the war. War never changes.
But obviously, war also sometimes does change, and is at least some respects, right? And so, I guess I'm curious from your perspective, you know, what you think and what you found to be relatively novel or unique with the war in Ukraine that maybe changes the way that we're thinking about war going forward into the future.
The mass use of drones and the way that like the recreational drones like DJI drones are being used and militarized, while it's not the first where there was experimentation by ISIS and other groups of the use of like drone drop grenades, the mass scale of it, its perfection and its continued evolution and scaling up of war, you're going to see a lot of this everywhere, and you're already starting to see it. You're already seeing it start to have an impact on Mali and other areas as well, with there even being some instances where it looks like possibly Ukrainian drone equipment is ending up in places like Sudan, and there's rumors about like Ukrainian advisors like advising enemies of Russia about how to engage in this type of drone warfare. And there's just two things that I think are going to push it forward. The first thing is just how cheap it is. A $300 drone taking out a $1.5 million tank is going to be always and forever very romantic for anyone who wants to win the defense economics of war. If it costs me $300 to destroy your $1.5 million piece of equipment, it's going to cost me a lot less to grind you down than it's going to cost you to continue pushing forward. And so the defense economics of it just makes it so it's almost impossible to like reject this from if you're someone like Ukraine, a small defender fighting against a much bigger state. Taiwan is now looking into drones like crazy because they invest about $20 billion every year in their armed forces, but they're going against China, who invests like well over $100 billion, going over $200 billion into their defense. And so how do you get the most bang for your buck? And these small unmanned systems, both UAVs when it comes to unmanned aerial vehicles, but also USVs, unmanned surface vessels, which are the drones that Ukraine have put on the water packed with explosives and taken out 30 to 40% of the Russian Black Sea Fleet with, making them pull it out of the area because they're too scared of a nation without a navy continuing to take naval W's over them. I mean, it's just the cost effectiveness of it is good. Another thing that I think also is going to push it forward is not just how cost effective it is, but the just complete transparency on the battlefield that drones have provided. Because while most drones, when we see videos of them, are like of FPV drones like ramming into different tanks and such, and that is a big way that Ukraine has fought to hold the line when it was going through the artillery shortage. At the end of the day, it's the Mavic drones and the big like fixed wing drones that are flying around and showing where all the troops are that are providing probably the biggest like overall strategic advantage to commanders. Because every part of the front, there are drones constantly monitoring everything. I remember when I was embedded with Mavic teams in the Donetsk region and the Kharkiv region, the way that they would do it is they would have two guys working on the drones, monitoring the area of the front that they've been assigned, and then after like 6 hours, they'll go eat, they'll go take a nap, someone will replace them, and they'll pilot it for 6 hours. And then they'll loop, and then they'll loop, and then they'll loop for 24 hours a day, so they always and forever have a camera looking at basically every part of the front line. And so if you're trying to gather tanks for an assault, or BMPs, or any of these armored vehicles,
they're going to know way in advance.
They're going to know way in advance, they're going to get their artillery in place, and they're going to hammer it. And this is why we see so many videos of armored assaults getting smacked down before each side saying, okay, how about we just do 10-man assaults or 12-man assaults, teams that are much harder to spot and are not going to show up so easily on the drones. And it's going to be not as cost effective for the Ukrainians to fire upon, for example, 2 or 3 men versus 20, 30, 40 men and a bunch of tanks.
Interesting. So it's not so much like
you're less of a target.
Yeah, so it's not so much like massive groups of infantry moving across Ukraine from Russia, but more so like small, harder to target groups.
A lot of 10-man assaults over and over and over and over again, but there is also big infantry assaults. It's just they can only do that if they can accept massive losses, and they have a lot of men, and it's crazy to say this, but they're running out of tanks.
Really?
They do have tanks like T-64s that they can pull from Soviet Reserve, but the speed that they're losing tanks, they cannot replace them with modern tanks, and eventually they're going to keep getting less and less tanks, and they're going to go deeper and deeper and deeper down to the bottom of the barrel, to the point where I'm seeing like BMPs with a gun taken off, and they strap some metal on top of it, and then they say, well, now it's just a normal armored transport, and it'll transport the troops to the front. It's why we're seeing more scooters, motorcycles, and Chinese golf carts being used in assaults on positions.
Really?
They still have a lot of armored vehicles. They still have the Soviet Reserve. It's just they cannot burn it at the current rate for another 2 years. That's why The Economist was talking about, and I was talking about this on other shows before this, and others have as well. I don't deserve a ton of credit, about them possibly really hitting a sticking point in 2025, because if they burn at current rates, they just won't be able to sustain it. Especially, and if they intensify operations, it'll even be worse. And so, I mean, you cannot gather those type, if you're having that problem, you can't gather like 20, 30, 40 tanks to make a push and risk losing all of those tanks at the same time and having no armored vehicles. Definitely when Soviet doctrine is built upon large armored assaults to go anywhere and capture anything.
Yeah.
When I say that they're going to change the battlefield face, like the face of warfare, or I say that they're going to make a lot of changes, that's not to say that they're going to be this all-powerful weapon that can never be countered. There are counters. Drone guns, jamming equipment. People have just shot them down with rifles. But when I'm on the front, the most persistent threat is one of two things. Either artillery, and earlier in the war, and I think that it's still a big contributing factor. They're one of the most major, if not the most major contributing factor to casualties on the battlefield is artillery, or drones. When I was on the front last time near the Volchansk axis, every second I was outside, I heard the small sound of those engines flying around, and you've got to sit there and you got to think, is that our drone? Is that their drone? And it's a constant presence that doesn't just have, you know, a physical effect of if it actually hits you, but a psychological effect. And it really is just this constant presence of drones that these troops have to live with, because now it's not just 10,000 drones, 20,000 drones. We're talking millions of drones over the battlefield.
That is terrifying to think about. I was under the impression, so it's often uncertain, based on what you're saying, whether or not a drone that's flying overhead or nearby is yours.
I've heard more than one complaint from fixed-wing aircraft pilots, for people who are piloting these drones, of their drones getting shot down by their own guys because they're scared, because they don't know, and if they call command, by the time they call command, it's too late, and so it's hide or shoot, and sometimes they choose shoot, and they end up shooting down their own drones. Communication is supposed to deal with that, but it doesn't always work. One thing that I've done, or I've been taught, is that if you're on a position, say, like I was with a mortar team 2 kilometers from Russian positions on the near the Levity axis, which is where the Russians attacked in Kharkiv recently.
Okay.
And while I was there, drones were constantly flying over. But if a drone would just fly over your position and keep going, or back and forth, then you can reasonably believe that they're not A, looking for you, and B, it's more likely than not that it's one of your guys' drones, because why, if it's not looking around. But if it is wandering, if you hear it hovering around your area, why would one of your own drones be hovering around your spot unless it's looking for something, targets, or it wants to hurt something, you? So if I hear a drone hovering, that's when I get most concerned.
How often is it for people to be killed by weaponized drones out there? Because it sounds like
very often. I mean, when I was in a stabilization point and I filmed there, I'm going to be releasing that in the next week, footage from the stabilization point. Like a half of them in that instance were coming in with injuries related to drones, either drone drop grenades, drone FPV drones, stuff of that sort. They are very common, especially for the Russians. They get a lot of drone injuries because the Ukrainians have very good drone pilots, and they have a lot of drone pilots, and they get quite a lot of drones. When I was with the FPV team in Kharkiv, they threw out, I think, 20 to 30 drones a day.
Wow.
And they took out, when I was with them, I saw them take out a gas station that they said the Russians used for like having troops there, like a staging point, and they took out a mortar position. But also their drones were getting shot down. So it's a game of how many of these drones can you get out there with not losing them, get to target. I remember one team had this rule where the one that loses the most drones has to wear a spinny hat.
I'm sorry. Like, I can appreciate having a bit of levity, because I'm sure that otherwise doing that kind of work is very emotionally taxing.
Absolutely. Because you have to be within range of the drone to be able to pilot the drone, and the Russians can even, and you can intercept their feeds as well, so you can see their drone footage as they're flying the drone around. And I was able to see the Russian footage come in, and so that's really dangerous. They could try to use that to find out where you are. If they do find out where they are, they want to take you out. Drone pilots are extremely high priority targets. It's extremely intensive work. When I was with the FPV teams, we had to jump into a trench more than once
what's the morale? I guess like this kind of reminds me of like a TikTok I saw the other day. I think I sent it to you, where it was like a Ukrainian soldier was doing the dance from the it was like a Deadpool
movie.
Yeah, the Deadpool movie. And I mean, like, some people are going to be critical of that. I think I like it because
they
it's probably,
need it. They've been doing this for 2.5 years. I get so annoyed with the. I can't believe there's levity in Ukraine. I see them at a McDonald's. I see them smiling with their children. If the Ukrainians aren't constantly crying and weeping and committing seppuku like live on television, then obviously it isn't a real war. It's silly. If you don't have things to relax, you will go insane.
Sure.
You need distractions, you need vices, you need something to take your eye off of all the death, destruction, and everybody having their life snuffed out. It's not normal to be around that 24/7 or to have that be the main topic that gets talked about. It'll drive you up a wall, make you go crazy. I mean, most of the people who are making these complaints are people who couldn't last like within a few months in these environments. And I mean, they can't even deal with like a stressful meeting without pulling out like their 3DS or something. Like I get, so it's, so I just don't, I don't put much weight into it.
So I guess related to that, could you just talk about the people that you met, like the general culture, what the people of Ukraine are like, how they've been able to kind of get through as a culture and as a community, get through this war? Yeah, I know. Just like talk a little bit about the people.
I mean, there's a big volunteer culture. Ukraine has some of the most volunteers, like as a percentage in the world, and some of the most donations, most charitable people in the world.
Oh, wow.
I think they have like the second most rate of donation in the world right now. I think it changes depending on what you call a charity and what you don't, because a lot of those donations are like military groups and stuff like that. And so whether or not it's legally a charity is another thing. But they're very, very giving, and it's a big volunteer culture. And a big reason why the Ukrainians have been able to survive is because where the government failed, just like 2014, there were volunteers who came forward and made up the difference. And having it be decentralized means that there was like more chances for people to innovate with drones, with people starting drone teams. There was more chances for people to just, make friend groups and no upper management like screwing them. While there is, of course, instances of corruption, like if you have a small group, you can have a lot less overhead and stuff like that. And it has benefits. Of course, centralization and more investment from above has its benefits as well. But I think the decentralized volunteer culture was one of the big things that saved Ukraine, with a lot of people like volunteering early on to like help the country. A lot of people who are no longer with us who made those early sacrifices. I think that was a big thing that has helped them. The diaspora has helped some amount by sending money back. Some people have come back to volunteer as well. That has been very helpful. I think that the Ukrainians, what's another thing that they've done that has been very effective? I think that the Ukrainians have a very stoic culture, and that helps to some extent. They very much like we will deal with it. We'll kind of very quiet culture.
Interesting.
But of course, it still hits them the same way. The emotion still hurts them the same way. But it takes time to really get to know somebody and have them really talk about their experience. Unless sometimes, which this does happen, somebody just wants to come out and just like spill out their heart and say everything they believe because they've been bottling these things up for so long and they want to complain about a commander or something along those lines. And I think another thing that's really helped in Ukraine is the ability to innovate and be flexible, not only with war planning, but also development and command, where command, like Sodal and other commanders who have been really awful, people speaking up and saying, these commanders are awful, these commanders are terrible, I don't care if he's connected with Syrskyi, I don't care if he's connected with Zelensky, we need to get rid of him. That led to Reskodov getting knocked out after the military jacket scandal. That led to a few people getting kicked out. Has it been enough? No, but it's the only way. It's one of the only tools that the public has to move them in the right direction. And I think that has been very good. Very strong hatred of corruption in the country, because corruption has been a major problem that has hurt people. And if that culture can continue, then the military hypothetically can continue to increase in quality. Just like the police force and many other institution needs to. And they have with time, but there's still a lot of problems.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like, that's good to hear about. Especially, I find it interesting that there's like an involved, or a very involved, like a disdain for corruption, does it have anything to do with like the close, like the Ukraine's historical relationships with Russia?
I mean, the Russians have fostered corruption, and that has been a problem.
Mm.
But it's not just like the Russian, like pro-Russian politicians who are corrupt. There's problems with pro-Ukrainian politicians being corrupt. There's corruption up and down Ukrainian society. A lot of it passed down from the Soviet period, and people buying up the state industries with their private capital. A lot of them just being the old Soviet barons, basically. The same guys controlling the same industries and profiteering. In Ukraine, after the Soviet collapse, like the economy was in rubble. It was going from being one of the most prosperous, predictive, like I think Deutsche Bank was saying, oh, it's the Soviet economy with the most prospect, to like 10,000 to 100,000 like percent inflation rate, like record-breaking inflation rate. And in that environment, in that chaos, there was not enough reform away from the old models. Corruption's metastasized, and it's been a problem ever since. And they've been moving in the right direction, but it's still a major problem. And it was actually one of the major motivators for the Euromaidan protest movement. That just doesn't get talked about as much because it's just not as like hot button when it comes to the Russians.
Gotcha. Interesting. All right.
But that's also another fear that like people don't want to be taken over by the Russians because the Russians are going to put on the old corrupt old guard again. So it's like not only is it a question about like domination from another country, but also like not particularly good domination either.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So switching topics a little bit. You've been talking a lot about your work with Ukraine and your general interaction with social media, but obviously you're a political content creator. And so one thing I like asking every political content creator I talk to is about their views on certain public policy issues that they feel really strongly about. So are there, like, what would you say is an area of public policy that you, and I mean, like, you know, it might end up being Ukraine, so it's fine if it is, but like what, in your opinion, is like a area of public policy that you feel is like super strongly about?
That I worked on the environmental board of my city in College Park, and I was pretty passionate about preserving green space, because in my city, the green space has been slowly disappearing over time to make way for like college campus development. And green space is important for a whole host of reasons. Not only, of course, like trees make air, like the most basic, you know, and trees are pretty and trees are beautiful, but they're also really important for cooling the city and making sure that, you know, that the heat that the sun puts off is controlled, kept down, and it's really important for a lot of urban quality of life. And some of the things that I've seen in Ukraine and European countries that integrate like these little like green areas well into the city and try to keep them, I've always liked and I've always respected quite a lot, and I hope that we can continue to keep as much green space as possible in my city.
Interesting. I'm trying to imagine. Okay, so then let me, because I'm not familiar with like that area of policy, so let me just ask you, insofar as you're aware, what are the main opponents to
developers?
Having greater
Developers.
Okay.
It's always developers, and you know, I believe that our housing crisis is both. There's a few problems with it, and part of it is that there needs to be more housing. If the more housing that is available in the market, the better. But a lot of times the development that's being offered or the areas that are being chosen are the areas that provide green spaces to low-income communities that now, when they're eliminated, there will no longer be a green space in that area. A green space that's needed to not only like temperature control, but just like basic quality of life. And once you get rid of that green space, it is much more difficult to get it back than to change development from one building to a different type of building, from one business to another business. You know, it's not only difficult because you know it takes time for the trees to grow, it takes time for the grass to grow, it takes time for the soil to be fertile, for the soil to be effective for this type of thing. But also, like, people don't want to give it up. Once you have like a commercial area available, do you really want to shrink the economy that little bit, eliminate 5-6 jobs in the smallest mom and pop to possibly like local business? In order to make way for a few trees that don't vote?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I definitely get that. Like, it's one of those things where once you do it, it's probably incredibly difficult to be able to undo it.
Yes.
Despite the fact that, you know, like, I definitely see the reasoning that, like, it's very important to have those kind of spaces in communities, right? Like, for example, like, being here in Baltimore, one of my favorite places to go is Patterson Park, which is probably one of the largest, nicest green spaces in the city. And I like being able to go there because, like, you know, living in the middle of the city, there's ultimately not going to be a ton of places where you can be able to go outside and get some fresh air and get exercise and, you know, get away from the hustle and bustle of city life, right? So I definitely get the merits of that. But I guess like, so developers are usually the main opponent. So like, what kind of arguments will they typically make? Like, do they argue that like, well, the green space might be important, but it's more important to develop like affordable housing, or like?
Yeah, it's usually an argument of like, what is more important? Is it more important to keep this green space, or is it more important to build more affordable housing? Is it more important to keep this green space, or is it more important to have this business investment in the community? There are sometimes some compromises where we'll plant some trees somewhere else, but then you look at the health of the trees, and the trees are not necessarily that good, not that healthy. Many of them do not survive. Or the green space that's being made is like way away from the area that the green space is being eliminated. And so we want the green space in, say, College Park, District 21, or somewhere else. And all of a sudden, it's in a district like all the way over here, a district right over in a different area where they have enough green space. Or that's not the area that's being negatively affected by your development. So how would it balance it out by moving the green space way away? And so these are like the compromises and debates that you usually have to have. Better integration of the development into the green space, i.e. having green space like on the property, or making greenery like integrated with the development, or making sure that the replacement green space that they put is in the community that they are trying to serve, so that their investments both in the green space and economically serve the community. These are like the type of things you want to develop, or I would like to see develop.
Gotcha. All right, and that relates to the next question I was going to ask. And I'm not asking this question because I'm staking out a personal position on this. I just asked this to all of my guests because I think it's a good exercise at the very least. Like, what would it take for you to change your mind and agree more with, like, in this case, it would be like developers. Let's say that you're dealing with a green space, like one that you've described, and developers come to you and they say, hey, we want to develop with this area or with this land. Like, what would it take for you to feel comfortable moving on your position and saying like, okay, yeah, I would agree to do some development?
Well, it would need to be like an area that green space that could be lost. If it's like some historical area or something like a park that's very beloved by the community, it'd be very hard for me to like move it. But let's say it was just a small patch of green space that they wanted to build property on.
Okay.
You could talk about how to integrate greenery into the area as like a first step. You can talk about, of course, like I said earlier, trying to have green space in other areas in the community so they can better serve, how many trees they would need to plant, having an equivalent, making sure that the trees that they are planting are alive, and making sure that if they do die, that they actually have to replace them, which that type of commitment is going to be maybe a little bit harder to get. But these are the type of compromises and things you can do to make sure that you can keep the quality of the city while developing the city. And sometimes there's going to be hard calls where you have to choose one or the other because the space isn't there, and you have to kind of do that by a case-by-case basis. But I lean towards the trees.
Gotcha. No, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess like I could definitely see, because I would like, that's an issue where I could reasonably see both sides of the argument, where like there's definitely like a major issue in Baltimore has been that the city has been trying to focus on is developing more affordable housing. Like that's something that the city is actively taking measures to address. Now, one of the interesting things I'm seeing them do, I won't name
the things that will anger me the most though is when there's abandoned properties not being used.
That's
and
the
they
thing,
want to get rid of the green space. That's the stuff that triggers me, because we could use this area. It's just it might not be the most prime of real estate, and so we'd rather get rid of the green space. That's going to take forever to get back if we ever can.
Yeah,
it makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, but I mean, like I do see a very interesting alternative that Baltimore, and I'm almost confident that other cities are pursuing this as well. It'd be stupid not to. Is focusing on areas where there is current buildings and infrastructure that are just completely like going unused completely, right? Like they're just completely vacant. And there's a lot of effort and investment being made to renovate those houses and make them into affordable housing. And I really like that as far as an alternative, because usually that's just, areas of a city that are just not being used whatsoever, and they're not green at the baseline. So it's like it seems like a better place to focus that development effort, and then be able to maintain the green space.
And plus, then you get rid of gross abandoned properties.
Yeah, which is going to help the quality of the city overall. So, okay, that's really interesting. It's just not an issue that I thought as much about, but like I see that investment in the city of Baltimore, which makes me, happy and proud to live here. So that's just, it's interesting. All right, cool. I think that answers my question there. So moving into the last section, we're getting there. All right.
Boy.
We've been on a long journey together. So
long journey.
I promise we're almost there.
Long journey, everyone.
So, you've had a lot of experience and you've gotten a lot of notoriety doing work on social media and also making an impact IRL with the work that you do, with being over in Ukraine and being able to do some real boots on the ground journalism. Like that's very impressive. One thing that I like to ask about for people who are watching who want to do similar kinds of content to what you might want to do, or who generally want to get involved with making political content online, but may not know where to start or know like the best inspiration, or like, you know, what the first step should be. What recommendations or what advice or wisdom would you give to people who either generally want to make political content on social media or who want to do stuff similar to what you do?
Make sure that if you want to say something, have something to say. Like, don't just, and I'm not the first person to say this on the show, but you should really make sure that if you're talking about something, you're not just saying something that somebody else said and you're repackaging and reposting it. You want to contribute something unique, not only because, you know, it'll give you something that you're providing to a viewer that they can't get anywhere else, and they might come back to you for, again, more unique perspectives, but also it doesn't feel good to just repeat what other people have said and you maybe kind of believe, or it kind of rubbed off on you. That's not to say that you can't take from other people to build original beliefs. You can put together a mosaic of beliefs. It's just make sure that you're contributing something original so people have a reason to watch you instead of something else when something comes up that people know that you might have knowledge about or you know about. It would make sense for me to get an upswing in viewership if there's big news in Ukraine. It wouldn't make much sense for me to get a huge upswing in viewership if Donald Trump has a new legal problem that I don't know about. And I mean, this would be the case if viewers are smart. It isn't a hard rule because viewers are not always smart, but that's your fault, not my fault.
Did you watch the interview with Natalie that I had?
I watched part of it.
Okay, it's very funny. You gave literally the exact same advice that she had.
If you're going to speak, have something to say. So only you can know what that is, because you know what you care about, you know what you're interested in, you know what you're knowledgeable about, you know what is exciting to you, and therefore what you could make exciting to other people. So on some level, you have to like customize your topic and your channel and whatever it is you're creating. You have to tailor it to your own personality and interests. So don't just try to imitate someone because someone else is talking about a certain topic. You're going to try talking about it. Okay, but are you interested in that topic? Do you have anything to say about the topic? A good like test for whether you have something to say about something is, do you find yourself thinking about it a lot? Like just spontaneously? Are you in the shower? Are you driving? And are you like running through arguments and thoughts about this topic in your head? If you are, then it's a sign that you have something that you want to say about this, right? If you find that you have to force yourself to think about a topic, you might not be a good person to talk about it because it's not interesting to you.
But hey, you know, if you didn't watch that, then maybe you just both are on the same wavelength. So
I guess like if I could give any other like advice.
It's fine. It is objectively good advice. So I'm not
use the thumbnail feature on YouTube to have multiple thumbnails. Test out different thumbnail ideas. That's a new feature. Not a lot of people know about it. I wish they had it when I started doing it so I could see which thumbnails work. Make sure that you don't use like really bad colors that don't mix with each other, and think about that when you're developing your brand. When you come up with your name, really do think about it, because think of like, hey, if this builds up, I'm gonna have to use this in possibly public settings. Like, do you want to go around being called Destiny for the rest of your life? That's a question you're gonna have to ask yourself.
First of all, if you're a guy and your name is Destiny, you're gonna have to make up for the fact that your name is Destiny.
Destiny, that's a woman's name.
Man, I wish I had more advice I could throw out there, but yeah, I would also say that, you know, if you're just like talking to like 1, 2, 3 viewership and like just a small group of people, like collaboration really is a way to grab the rocks above you and try to start pulling. Try to get in front of other audiences so you can start that initial kick. Just waiting for the algorithm to gift you viewership and gift you viewers is a fool's errand. It's not impossible. Sometimes it does, but it's very rare, and you have to kind of figure out the magic for yourself. So I would say collaboration is key. Staying off in your own little fortress arc is not going to work for you unless you've already developed that audience. It's the same reason why like people who get started on Twitch, I don't think you should just start on Twitch. You should probably try to bring an audience from somewhere else if you don't have a lot of connections, because Twitch is very bad for discoverability. You have to bring people from elsewhere or collaborate to climb up the ladder.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. That's pretty consistent with my experience, because even when I began streaming on Twitch forever ago, I only started doing that after I had been creating content on YouTube for a while, kind of doing like the React Andy, post a video like every day reacting to something sort of content. after I had grown from that, it was only then that people recommended like, oh, you should check out these panel shows or whatever happening on Twitch, right? And that was what motivated me to go over there. But like I brought
Which panel shows?
It's so long ago, I can't remember.
I can't remember.
It was definitely Hippy Dippy. It was 100% Hippy Dippy and nobody else. All right.
Absolutely.
Don't worry about
Every
it.
time.
Every time.
Ranks 1 through 10 best panel show.
100%.
Every year, even the years they were off.
But no, like I definitely hear that, and and I think that there is, even to the point I was just joking about the fact that Natalie, I just think it's genuinely good advice. Like I think a lot of people, a big issue, and I talked about this before, so I won't rehash all of it, but like nowadays I just I want to enjoy using social media. I do genuinely want, like, I like parts of it and I want to like it more, but sometimes I feel like I open YouTube and it's just like a bunch of sludge that is just like, oh, this person is just giving a milquetoast reaction to whatever the modern political trend is. And at that point, like, I might as well just watch David Pacman or someone similar.
It's almost like they're just like a news ticker. And I mean,
Yeah.
I have that problem sometimes where I feel like I'm reading the story and I have to kind of talk about it because it is the big story, but I don't have a lot to say.
Yeah.
And so what I try to concentrate in those situations is I just try to concentrate on being accurate. Because if I'm going to be a news ticker, I might as well just be an accurate news ticker getting the information across. Like when a live story is happening, like a shooting or something, and people jump to come to the conclusions about, like, I don't know who it is exactly, but they're them. Whoever they are, they're them. That's the guy who did whoever they are, they're the enemy. The enemy did it. Whoever the enemy is. I just want to concentrate on giving good information if I don't have the information to give them, like, an extremely unique or expertise perspective. And the most you can do is try to be accurate.
Yeah. I mean, like, I even think, like, I'm not even necessarily saying that you have to be, like, an expert per se to be able to talk about something, because otherwise no one's going to talk about anything, and there's never going to be anything on social media. So I'm not necessarily, like, I wouldn't even prescribe that. I think about the advice, I keep quoting back to the Natalie interview, so I apologize for that, but, like, there's just, like, relevant bits from there. She even made the prescription, like, or gave the example of, like, if you're a janitor, talk about your experience as a janitor.
But again, I think, like, you kind of bring whatever your background is to the creative thing that you're doing. It doesn't have to be a philosophy degree, right? If you want to talk about philosophy at an academic or almost academic level, then it certainly helps to have a background in academic philosophy. But why should that be the thing you want to talk about? If your experience is like being a janitor, then talk about being a janitor. I'm sure there's interesting things that are the result of that experience, Whatever your background is, that will animate your writing or your creative work. The essayist, like pre-video essayist, traditional essayist, David Sedaris, his kind of breakout work was about being an elf, at a department store, like like a worker dressed as an elf. And his breakout story was nonfiction about that experience. He made it really funny. So, if that's your background, then use that. Use whatever is in your background and lean on that as a subject matter. Don't pretend that you know a bunch of stuff about something that you don't know about, because people will always be able to tell.
Right, like just, bring your, what's most important is that you bring your own background, whatever that background is, and then if you are really passionate about relating whatever you're reacting to your background, to like who you are as a person, then that's probably more important insofar as like having an audience of people who want to watch you and who sincerely want to consume your content than really anything else. That's super useful. So then the last question I have for you, Dylan, is what do you use, or like how do you use your social media platform to make a difference in IRL politics? You've talked about that, like a little bit throughout, but like in your own words, how would you say that you make a difference IRL? And how would you recommend other people, like what wisdom would you give to other people, or what advice would you give to other people who want to use social media to do the same?
I try to do my best. I think one of the main ways social media is used directly is like fundraising, because using social media to make people turn out for events, or like necessarily organizing, is a lot more difficult than people I think first assume.
Yeah.
That's why a lot of like TikTok and like social media politicians end up bombing in the general election, is because they have no ground game and they only know how to make catchy TikToks. I think it was Valeria Gomez in the recent, Secretary of State race, Joshua Collins for the left. There was a bunch of different people who have this problem. And so I think fundraising is something that has been proven that it's not the hardest thing to do. I've used social media to fundraise for demining equipment in Ukraine to help CESU like get rid of the explosives that are hurting civilians. Most people can find different ways to fundraise and stuff like that using social media. That's one way, probably one of the easier ways that you can use social media to do good. Another thing is to, I think, get general information out.
Sure.
Get basic information out, general information out as events are happening. But I mean, of course, if you want to be good, you have to stick to the facts. You got to stick to the information to inform people. And I think that's the two main things: is fundraising and information spreading when it comes to how you can have an IRL impact. But the information you need to spread needs to be actual information, voting locations, and like information about like a health crisis. Or I mean, this is why I think like, you know, certain law enforcement departments have social media, is because they want to be able to tell people if there's a crisis. So I think these are the two main ways that social media can actually have an impact. As for organizing, like, I mean, Twitter DMs, I can like ask people for interviews and stuff like that. That's useful. It's another way to reach people, another way to quote unquote stay connected.
Sure.
But you're not going to organize anything solely from the internet. If you want to organize in politics, you got to go meet people in person. You got to go canvass if you want to learn what canvassing is. You got to go to the local city council meetings and county council meetings if you want to know how those meetings are done, how legislation is passed, who your county representatives are, who your city representatives are. You're not going to be able to do all of politics from the comfort of your home. I mean, even if you add in phone banking, like if you're not turning out at the voting booth, or if you're not turning people out at city hall meetings to question them about why they're doing things, then you're always going to be limiting yourself. So the main thing I would tell, like outside of those things that I just said you can use social media to do, the main thing I would say is get off social media. Get off social media, get out in person, and then when you come back to it, you might be able to add an even more rich perspective to social media and maybe some way be able to actually organize people to help. But again, mainly getting people to turn out using social media is the most difficult part of it. So I would say it's not the main thing you should expect your Twitter to do, is get people to turn out to canvassing events. You can still use it to promote it, but IRL politics mostly is impacted by information spreading and fundraising when it comes to social media.
Yeah, no, and I really like that. I definitely think that there's a lot to be said about information spreading and fundraising. I definitely agree with that. That's probably like the main ways that you could be able to use social media effectively, especially for like most of your average streamers, right? I do think there are exceptional cases like with Destiny where I think that, and this is from, I'm also thinking back to my interview with Kyla, I think that there is something exceptional about streamers where, because of the nature of their relationship with their viewers, it probably is a lot more likely that they can be able to get people out to canvas and do IRL events.
Type of dynamic that occurs between a streamer and viewer is like different than almost any other form of social media, right? Like TikTok is notorious for low conversion. You get lots of eyes on it, but it doesn't turn out to sales very often. Most like major TikTokers that I know complain how they like have like 500,000 followers on TikTok and they can't break like 10K on YouTube, right? Because the transference is so low.
Gotcha, yeah.
So part of what's unique about streamers is the quote unquote like parasocial relationship. There's often viewed in like a very negative way. Most research that's been on it is pretty neutral. It can be negative, it can be positive. Usually it's just kind of neutral. But essentially the viewers have this more bought in relationship with the streamer and with the community. Right, so it becomes its own community as well. And so when Steven says you guys should come to Ohio, viewers go, well, A, I can meet Steven, but B, these 4 other people that I've been like talking to in chat for like the last 6 months, I can meet them finally and like hang out. So there's like a friendship opportunity as well.
That probably is true.
Yeah, but it's not just like Twitter and Instagram. They have to integrate the messaging into their stream, into the YouTube content, like advertise it across all of their platforms.
Yeah, and so I definitely agree with that. But I think that I think it is possible to do that. It's just that streamers probably are a lot more likely. Like another thing from our conversation I remember talking about is the fact that like when the TikTok ban was going through Congress, I think I also talked about this with Josiah. There was an article, I'll post this down in the description of this video as well, where it talked about the fact that despite all of the despite all of the criticism and the feedback on TikTok about the ban, like there were videos talking about it that would get like hundreds of thousands and like millions of views and likes, right? So much engagement, so many people were aware of it and did not want it to go through. And yet, when they interviewed people on the Hill that were actually working on the legislation, several people said, oh, we got like barely any people coming out and calling and actually protesting the bill, you know? Like that actual, you know, the nature of the relationship between TikTok viewers and TikTok creators is very different and not as strong, where you can't really make those kinds of asks as reliably as people like political streamers or streamers in general.
The revolution will not be live streamed, okay?
No, but I think that you probably are more likely to actually get people who follow your live stream to do something than people who follow your TikTok. That much is probably true, or I'm willing to bet. So there's that element. That said, I still think that what you said that about fundraising, information spreading, definitely like the main ways that we should consider. But I like the idea of figuring out how to make the magic sauce happening for getting people to do more IRL events.
I'm not against experimenting. It's just there's no proven like track record of social media alone. You have to integrate it with other things. Again, I will tweet out when I'm doing if I'm doing something and I want people to like see it and maybe like go check it out. But it's bad for directing people to YouTube. It's bad for directing people to all sorts of stuff. It's just not very effective to directing them towards outside sources off Twitter, number one. So getting them to not only go off Twitter, but into their goddamn car and drive out. That's another question.
Yeah, no, I definitely get that. To another point that you raised in your answer a second ago, I really like the idea of, for as much as we talk about, especially like with what I do, using social media to make a difference IRL, I agree that it is also fundamentally important to get off social media and make sure that you are going out IRL and developing those relationships with local political stakeholders.
If you do not, you will become disconnected. Yeah. Social media will become your life, and then you'll be trapped on the internet bubble. Not living in the real world, you'll be living on the internet.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like fundamentally. And also, to tie this back in with the advice earlier of only say something if you have something to say, right? And how that, I believe at least, fundamentally comes from having a unique perspective, one that's relatively different from other people who are also competing and creating online content. There's also something to be said that, like, if you're a person and you're going out and you're getting involved in your local, like local politics or state level politics, which is very, mind you, very easy to do, right? Like in the Maryland legislature, when you're in session, you can just walk into the House or the Senate. Yeah, you can just show up. You can just show up. You can testify. You can just like go talk to. You can just go up to the office of like your representative and knock on the door. And be like, hey, like, are you free for a moment? Can I pop in? You just like have a conversation. It's very easy to set up. The one bit of advice I'll have though is that if you want to get an in-person discussion with your representative, call ahead of time and then tell them that you are in their district and use the zip code. If you do that, you're almost certainly going to be able to get a conversation. But you can like it's
not a conversation, a response.
Yeah, exactly. You'll either get a response and probably get a conversation. At least that's the way it is in Maryland. I can't speak as strongly to other states, but that's my experience here. And so it's like, it's so easy to be able to do that. And then once you've done that, even if it's once, you have more experience talking about actual applied politics than the vast majority of other people who are on social media.
Yep.
Like the vast majority. A lot of people have not even left their basements who spend all of their time on social media. I'm sorry. So it's like, it's so, not only is it like effective, not only good for you, but also if you're just thinking from the perspective of like, oh, how can I make myself competitive against other people? It'll make you more competitive like instantly. So it's like, it just seems like there's so many good reasons to do it from both like kind of a moral, applied perspective.
It's also much more enriching.
Yeah, that's also true. You can be able to go and spend time in your state legislature. I'm sorry, I'm making the pitch, but I also love my state legislature, so I digress. But yeah, no, I think that there is something to be said about going out and getting the IRL experience, because like even if you end up spending a lot of time doing that, you're going to come back and you're going to have such a more meaningful perspective on what you do. That's going to not only help your content, but help, in theory, all the people who are watching you. So yeah, I like that. For all those reasons, I also really like the advice to turn off your phone and go and actually get involved locally.
Turn off your phone, go to a boring political meeting in your state's capital.
Well, hey, the people, there is, I won't name the particular person, but like a quick anecdote is there's a guy in the Maryland legislature. He's not like an elected representative. He's just like a guy who is super far right, super conservative. He probably watches like, I don't know, think of like all of your most basic, unentertaining far right podcasts, right? He probably watches all of them. And every time he opens his mouth in the Maryland legislature, people just kind of roll their eyes and whatever. But more people have more important relevant stakeholders are probably familiar with him and have listened to him more than the vast majority of people who spend all of their time tweeting on social media.
Amen.
All right, that makes me it makes me mad, because that sounds like, that intuitively sounds like that just shouldn't be the case, right? That sounds like an injustice. But also it makes me motivated, because the way to remedy that is by getting involved and going and testifying and adding something more nuanced and important to the discussion, right? So it's like,
and can I just say, it's a lot harder to tell somebody to end their own life when they're not on Twitter. And so the conversation, just the quality of the conversation, while there's still going to be the crazies, like it can't be as bad.
Yeah,
it just can't.
It necessary. I mean, like sometimes, like I will say,
it will get bad, but it just can't be as bad as consistently.
Yeah, like there are, like I've in my time working in the Maryland General Assembly or like being involved over there, like I've heard some crazy stuff over there. Nowhere near as crazy as the kind of stuff that you see on Twitter. All right, it is just not comparable. So I mean, like you will still get your crazies, but it is a lot better comparatively speaking than spending all of your time on social media. Yeah, so
get off Twitter.
Get off Twitter. That's the takeaway. That's the TLDR.
You can follow me on Twitter at DylanBird1776.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. And also on that note, so Dylan, thank you so much for watching. I've really enjoyed, Thank you so much for talking. I really enjoyed this. Can you please tell the people who are watching where they can find you on social media?
Sure. In the streets of Dnipro, if you go into an alleyway and you bang your foot on the ground 3 times and yell out, "Call," I will come and tell you about the war. That is the one and only place you can find my content.
Nowhere else.
Oh, well, you can also find me at Dylan Burns TV on YouTube.
Oh, really?
And Dylan Burns Live for my daily commentary. Dylan Burns 1776 on Twitter and Dylan Burns TV on Instagram. Or do the Dnipro thing. I'd be more impressed if you did.
All right. I don't even know how to follow up on the joke of that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
Happy to be here.